Okay, welcome to my forest. Welcome to my living room. Okay, tonight's talk is about this idea that somehow there's a symmetry relationship between life and intelligence, just as Einstein's E equals mc squared described this symmetry between energy and matter. We think something identical really is happening with two other fundamentals of the universe, life and intelligence, that exists a relationship, not of analogy or metaphor, one of absolute symmetry between life and intelligence. Okay, so we're going to go straight to the first screen share. Okay, so get the right diagram. I should have got this. Okay, can we all see the screen share? So is that visible to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so basically, okay, a kind of overview of the idea. Because the idea is this: basically, there is life in intelligence, and basically, there's life as we understand it, which is evolution, ontogenesis, genomics, gene regulatory networks, and genes. Then there's intelligence as we understand it, which is neurons, neural networks, brains, thought, behavior, learning, and creativity. So what this diagram shows is basically that there's a symmetry relationship between all the aspects of this diagram. I know it sounds outlandish, but when I explain latest findings on how neurons actually work and latest findings on how genes and gene regulatory networks work, then it will become crystal clear that this idea is really kind of one of those great unifying ideas that comes around occasionally. So this notion of symmetry, what symmetry does, it basically shows that two separate things are really the same thing. So, like E equals mc squared, matter and energy, they're kind of interchangeable. They're really aspects of the same thing, two sides of the same coin. And we can even look at electromagnetic spectrum, the theory of electromagnetic spectrum, that magnetism, light, and electricity seem like different phenomena, but underlying it is actually the same underlying symmetry or same phenomena underlying it. So we think the same thing pertains to life and intelligence and all these aspects of life intelligence. So it's this diagram across, there's a kind of symmetry going across. But we think it goes a little bit deeper than that. We'll explain in a minute. Okay, we'll just give some preliminaries. We're just going to explain what symmetry is in the most kind of generic, all-encompassing, but also at the same time most generic way. Okay, symmetry is a really important concept. Some people say that we have science because there is symmetry in the universe. Some people even say that science is symmetry. So symmetry really is fundamental a concept behind science. The basic idea behind symmetry is this notion of transformation and invariance. Okay, so change and immunity to change. So with a given set of transformations, a given set of aspects stay invariant with respect to those given set of transformations. So, a very easy way, kind of a layman's way to explain this is with this diagram. See at the top, you basically have different shapes that are transformed. You see the arrows transform a kind of square to a hexagon, to a circle, to a pentagram. Now the shape changes, but the color remains the same. So the color is the invariant aspect. In the bottom diagram, the color changes. Oh, sorry, I clicked the damn touchpad. What's going on? What's going on? How did I get there? I zoomed over there somehow. Yeah. That's what happened there. Okay. So in the bottom diagram, okay, you have a square. The square stays the same, but the color changes. So basically, with this given set of transformations, I am changing the color. The invariant aspect is the square. Okay, and you think back to high school. There's this kind of high school concept of symmetry you learned, which really emerged during the European Renaissance, and it's the same idea, really. You got this idea of a square. You can rotate it 90 degrees, 270 degrees, 360 degrees, 180 degrees, and it appears as the same. And you can flip it, you can reflect it in this kind of like a line of mirror reflection, and it stays the same. So under these given set of transformations of rotation and reflection, the invariant aspect is the overall form of that square. Now, another example is here, which is this idea. You take one shape, you can translate it, you can rotate it, you can scale it, you can reflect it, you can scale and rotate. No, they look like different shapes, but it's basically the same original shape. The transformation, these affine transformations transformations make this kind of variety of shape, but underlying it, it's basically the invariant aspect. It's basically the kind of like the angles between the lines and the proportions between the lines. So that's another example of symmetry. So again, kind of transformation and invariance to that transformation. A very important related idea, which we'll need to explain the brain and the genome, is basically this idea of self-symmetry or self-similarity, i.e. fractals. It's a notion of basically you take a basic shape, you make a smaller copy of itself, and you place it within itself. So see, I've taken that same basic brain shape from the previous diagram. All I've done is basically made smaller copies of itself and have recursively nested. I repeated it again and again. And that's an example of a fractal. Here's a kind of fractal broccoli. You see the entire broccoli is kind of reflected in little bits of the broccoli. And this is a fractal hexagon. So the little dodecahedron, I should say. Now, the most important kind of fractal, this is going to be really important in this talk, is a tree. Now, so like a branch of a tree is like the entire tree, and like a bonsai, a little tree made from a branch is like a big tree, but even the leaves of a tree also have this branching patterns in each leaf. What's really important is, for our purposes, is in the bottom right of the diagram, a binary tree. Okay, so basically binary trees we think are really, really important for explaining the brain and genomics. Okay, so that's kind of like a basic idea of symmetry. Now, okay, I'm just going to stop the screen share for a little bit. Okay. Now, okay, I mean, this is why I got the tree background in my living room, because trees are really, really important, okay, in the universe and in this theory. Okay, what first I want to explain is this idea that somehow a neuron has a symmetry relationship with a gene. I know that sounds really implausible because people think they understand how neurons work. And there's a model of a neuron, which is it came out like 40 years ago, 50 years ago, actually, which basically is completely out of date. And this is what most people, 99% of all people on the planet, working in AI, neuroscientists even, have this kind of old model of the neuron. But really, new results come out in the past, literally 5-10 years. New results coming out now, literally, in the past year, that are really kind of quite groundbreaking in this kind of like a study of neurons. So back to screen share. Okay, get the right diagram this time. Get the right screen share. Okay, so basically this is where we were. Okay, share. Okay, so we're sharing this screen here. Now, okay, so we're starting at kind of the bottom of the diagram. We're going to work our way up over the entire diagram. So on one side you have a gene, on the other side you have a neuron. So how is a gene identical to a neuron? We're going to explain. But first we need to explain the fallacy, the old idea of a neuron, which is completely mistaken. You see this, a diagram like this in practically every single book about artificial neural networks you can buy, even new ones that have just come out in the past year. I mean, this is reflects a kind of fallacy about how neurons are supposed to work. Let me just explain the old model before we completely trash it. Okay, so this idea of artificial neuron, this is the cell body, and basically you have each of these are inputs. These are synapses, basically, like the spokes of a wheel. You could have 100 inputs, and each of the synapses, the artificial synapses, their sole purpose is to shuttle the information, like the spokes of a wheel, from the synapse to the cell body. And then there's a linear summation of those inputs. And then you have an activation function, which is something like a sigmoid or rectified linear unit, and then you have an output, which might be probabilistic. Okay, now it's completely mistaken. It's not even like a grain of truth reflecting, how neurons actually work. Okay, so look, a completely new way of looking at neurons has emerged in recent years. That's been kind of bubbling for the past few decades, but it's really burst through in the past, I reckon the past 5 years, really. That's kind of really come out. And even a lot of neuroscientists are unaware of this kind of like new understanding because it's brand new. Now, the diagram here is essentially the workhorse neuron of the brain, the pyramidal cell. So basically you have these varieties of pyramidal cell distributed all over your cerebral cortex, mainly in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is really important. Now, okay, so what we see here is basically the cell body is here. Now, what you're seeing around here, these are the dendrites. Okay, so it's the dendrites put the information into the neuron, and the axon has the information coming out. Now, in the previous diagram, that is the dendrites of a neuron, and that is depicted as the axon. Now, in terms of morphology, how neurons actually look, this is interesting in itself. Okay, basically, imagine that, okay, this is a dendrite and the soma of the body. This is the cell body. So this is these two are two typical pyramidal cells. You see, look, that is what you saw in the previous diagram, the dendrites and the cell body. All the gray area are its axons. And this is another example. It's this tiny little blob here. That's like what you saw in the previous diagram. That's the dendrites and the cell body, the inputs to the cell and the cell body. But all this orange stuff is the axons, is the output of that neuron. You see, it's very, very spread out, isn't it? It's very, very diversified and spread out. Now, one of the changes that have happened in recent years is this idea, okay, this is this quick list diagram of some of the most relevant points we'll be discussing. Okay, the new 21st century diagram is that, okay, neurons are dynamic. They're constantly reconfiguring. Okay, this is sped up. These are neurons in a Petri dish. But the thing is, neurons throughout your lifetime, except in lower parts of your sensory and motor hierarchy, cortex, are basically almost practically throughout your brain, they're constantly reconfiguring. Now, the reconfiguration happens at a kind of glacial pace. If you actually looked at it, it happens at a glacial pace because it's, it's very packed inside your brain. But the thing to understand is that, I'll just stop the screen share for a bit. And the thing to understand is that in aggregate, there's actually lots and lots of like reconfiguring going on. So even though you hardly see any movement over time, over even each second in aggregate, in all the billions and neurons and trillions of synapses moving around and axons growing out, there's actually lots of reconfiguring going on. And at the extreme end, there's actually in a part of your brain called the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, actually new neurons form. We're not talking about 1 or 2 new neurons a day. We're talking thousands and thousands, up to about 5,000 or 6,000 neurons form every day in your brain. They migrate to what's called dentate gyrus, and these neurons then spread out axons and dendrites. So you see, the brain is a dynamic thing. It's actually constantly reconfiguring itself. As we see later on, this reconfiguring, this axons exploring out, is actually part of the algorithm by which neurons work. Okay, so it's actually a dynamic thing. Back to the screen share. Okay, so I better get this right, get the right diagram to share. Where was I? I was here. Okay, so okay, we have the typical like pyramidal cell again. So the next kind of new finding of how neurons work is this idea that basically the neuron is separated into these dendritic patches or compartments. Okay, and a typical neuron literally has not hundreds, thousands of these compartments. Now, if you imagine the axis from top to bottom, it's about 1 millimeter. Okay. Now, each of these compartments or patches is about 20 to 25 micrometers. Now, if you, just to give you a kind of perspective on that, if you look at the diagram, now see where I shake my cursor, 20 to 25 micrometers is about that. It's a tiny sliver, can you see? It's a tiny sliver of dendrites. And that tiny sliver of dendrite might contain, dozens, quite a few synapses, but the main thing is that the neuron contains literally thousands, even tens of thousands of these separate modules that are each 25 to 25 micrometers across. And the really interesting thing is that these modules are autonomous. They can function as autonomous kind of components. And what they also do is they learn across themselves. So basically, they do associative learning across the module. This is one of the actual problems in artificial intelligence and neural networks. This idea of compositional learning, that they can't seem to get the existing neural networks to do compositional learning very well. Well, this new model of the neuron and the brain, it describes the entire brain as one great big compositional learning hierarchy. That each of these modules will take inputs from different parts of the neurons, and over a module, it will form an association bond between all these inputs. It composites those inputs. Okay, what's more than that? Okay, the next kind of point on the diagram, that these dendritic patches and compartments, they do complex dendritic computation. Okay, they do AND, which is like composition. They kind of composite over half a dozen, 4, 5, 6 kind of inputs, and they kind of conjugate, do compositional learning. but also do like all learning, disjunction, and also not. But really exciting is that just 2 years ago, it was discovered that over a kind of compartment, you can do exclusive OR over a tiny patch of dendrites, 20 to 25 micrometers across. Now the significance of exclusive OR is that basically it was one of those functions that the old generation neural networks just couldn't do. It was for perceptrons. But these new discoveries show that real neurons do exclusive OR over a tiny patch of dendrite. It was known for over 10 years that you could do exclusive OR over a dendritic branch, but the recent finding from 2 years ago, it can actually do it over a patch of dendrite. So it's actually doing complex combinatorial logic even over a tiny patch of dendritic patch. So that's a kind of like a finding which just kind of like really blows away the existing ideas of how neurons are supposed to work. Another important finding is that, okay, the old model of a neuron is basically the cell body has a spike, integrates the signal from all these kind of bicycle spoke inputs from all the synapses. What's discovered now is, okay, that each of the main inputs into the cell body, the dendrites, each have a major spiking zone, which itself can actually activate the entire neuron to spike. What's also recently been discovered in the past 10 years is that there are literally thousands of dendritic spiking zones all over the neuron, and so basically all over the dendrites of this neuron, you can activate spikes, action potentials, little mini action potentials over the entire surface of the dendrites of the neuron. Now, the exciting thing is that these dendritic spikes that can be activated autonomously in these little modules themselves can lead to synaptic strengthening, i.e. long-term potentiation, what's called spike time dependent plasticity. So it means that basically each little kind of patch of dendrite can function as an autonomous unit, can actually do its own learning in a little patch. The next finding is basically, dendritic spikes is this idea of backward action potentials. Now, this is a very old idea. It was first noticed in what's called Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. And then over the decades, it was found to happen all over the brain in pyramidal neurons and also what's called spiny stellate cells in the striatum. But what's really important now is that basically the backward action potentials, yes, they happen all over the pyramidal neuron, but these dendritic spikes can also generate little backward action potentials. So you see, it's like a fractal. The entire neuron generates a great big backward action potential, but then the local dendritic spikes also generate these local backward action potentials. The really exciting thing is that basically these backward action potentials in the little spiking zones in the little compartments can chain up with what's happening in the cell body. So there's this other phenomenon called backward chaining. So from the body of the neuron, the soma, you basically have this backward chaining phenomena, like almost like a growth process. You're growing like a representational structure. Years ago, 30 years ago, there were results from experiments in rabbits where in the hippocampus in the CA1 region, you had this backward chaining effect. They basically had this kind of translocation of a kind of protein called protein kinase C, that over the days or weeks as a rabbit learned stuff, it basically translocated from the proximal dendrites near the cell body, and it kept reaching back to the more distal dendrites. Now, this backward chaining process seems to be more common because it's basically something you're probably thinking, if you have all these separate compartments, autonomous from the cell body, how do they influence cell spiking? And it's exactly through this backward chaining process. Now if the, I'll just stop the screen share so I can actually, now if there is a cell body, okay, that spikes, these compartments somehow have to activate the cell body, have to get the signal to reach down into the cell body. So what happens is that basically there's a kind of like association effect, two-way association. You have the kind of like dendritic spikes going forwards, but what happens is that when the cell body spikes, the main soma of the neuron spikes, it sends a backward action potential. Now, the backward action potential will facilitate the local dendritic spike from going forwards. Okay, but vice versa, if the dendritic patch spikes or there's an excitatory postsynaptic potential, then it facilitates the backward action potential going backwards. So you see, so you need a chain of dendritic spikes for that backward action potential to propagate backwards. You see, it's like a backward chaining effect of representation and excitation. And when you get this feedback effect of the backward action potential with the feedback, dendritic spikes, then it leads to a kind of burst firing effect, because kind of resonance. To cut a long story short, we can give an entire 2-hour talk about neurons and these new neuronal findings. But what we just want to say enough to show that basically the new understanding of neurons is just something, when a single dendritic patch has more power than even several artificial neurons working together, then you see that the reason why these artificial neural networks are really not doing it. They can be useful, but they're really not achieving true artificial intelligence. Okay, so we think there's a new generation of neural networks that is emerging, that will emerge, that we are creating, which will basically be based on real neurons. Okay, so this is a kind of like it's a great selling point, isn't it? Okay, now we've discussed just enough about neurons, okay, to be able to show now the symmetry between this new understanding of how neurons actually work and genes. So we're going to shift our attention now to genes, okay. So tonight's talk is going to cover quite a lot of ground, but it's going to be worth it. There's a huge knockout punchline at the end. It's like really, anyway, we talk about genes now. Okay, so how is a neuron like a gene? That sounds impossible. A gene is like a string, isn't it? It's a strand of DNA. And a neuron's like a tree, as we've just seen. It's like, it's like a neuron is that. And a gene is like a string. So how is a piece of string like a tree? Well, the answer is that basically, okay, let me stop the screen share. Okay, stop just so I can do a little demo. Look, like this. It's not doing it. Well, anyway, like if I do it here, like this is like a USB cable. It's like this is my gene. Okay, what happens is that basically this gene is very intricately looped. It's called a loopome. So that is the kind of like the transcription, or the kind of where the RNA polymerase transcribes the protein. Well, the gene is kind of looped like this. Okay, it's kind of looped. It's very intricate, really, really intricate. See, it's a little demo. Anyway, the reason for that looping is really important because it allows us to basically loop what's called Cis Regulatory Modules. Okay, so look, in this diagram, in the top, you have a strand of DNA, and you have basically what's called a Cis Regulatory Module. And a Cis Regulatory Module, what it does, it basically takes on, it binds what's called transcription factors. And the transcription factors, if they bind in a certain combination, they will activate the gene. Okay, what does that mean? What does that mean? Let me go to the bottom kind of left of the diagram. So if we kind of like, if you go to this part, the red section here is the actual coding region of the gene. Okay, so basically here we have the RNA polymerase. So when a gene is activated, the RNA polymerase rolls down the gene, and it basically, messenger RNA comes out, and basically it's like the gene has fired. Then that messenger RNA either makes a protein, it makes a kind of structural protein, or makes a metabolic enzyme. Okay, obviously, your genome creates your body, so it creates proteins and metabolic enzymes, structural proteins. It also makes a third thing called a transcription factor, about 1600 in the human genome. Now, what a transcription factor is, it's a message from, it's a special kind of protein that basically talks to these transcription factor binding sites on these cis regulatory modules. So you see, basically, if you have the right number of kind of transcription factors or the right combination binding onto your cis regulatory module, then basically what happens is that this cis regulatory module, you can see in this diagram, each of these blue lines are like 4 different cis regulatory modules. If you have the right binding pattern on each of these, they basically will activate the gene, and the gene in a sense will fire, you see. And the way that a gene is like a neuron is that, okay, you've got these like 3 main loops, okay, and basically these 3 main loops correspond to like CRM1. Can you see in the bottom right of the diagram? CRM2, CRM3. Now, each of those cis regulatory modules can activate the gene if they have the right transcription factors bind onto them. So basically, these cis regulatory modules work exactly like the kind of patches of dendrites that basically can have these local dendritic spikes that can activate the cell body, the neuron to fire. And the analogy is it goes quite far, because it's recent findings have shown that basically the brain is quite a breakthrough finding from 2015 that it was discovered that the number of representational cliques from this paper in 2015 say that the rabbit has to learn 3 factors. Okay, it's like to do with smell, to do with touch, or whatever. Then they found basically it was 2 to the power of the number of factors minus 1. The significance of that is basically it's doing a combinatorial coding of the 3 factors, you see. So it's actually doing a combinatorial coding in the same way that the cis regulatory modules is doing a combinatorial recognition of these transcription factors. And to complete the analogy with neurons, these cis regulatory modules can also do a kind of limited summation. So it can also treat these transcription factors in a summatory way. You can add them up, in other words. So if given the right conditions, then these transcription factors binding on the cis regulatory module will make the gene fire, and it's probabilistic. It'll increase the probability of a gene firing, just like a neuron. They work probabilistically. In a sense, these kind of cis regulatory modules are like the kind of dendrite of the gene, the receiving end. But what is the kind of transmission end? What is the axon? Well, the axon is basically, if you look in the bottom right of the diagram, you have the gene, and basically if it outputs a transcription factor, then the transcription factor, the protein, will bind on specific binding sites. So I'll stop the screen share for a bit. So it's like this. You have neurons that are kind of joined together with axons and dendrites, like a physical wire. And you have a point-to-point connection between one neuron and another neuron, like a physical wire, like a landline, like a telephone with a physical wire. Imagine 2 telephones physically linked with a wire. Then that's like an axon and dendrite, 2 neurons communicating. But you can imagine the alternative. You have a mobile phone. Okay, 2 mobile phones communicating. That's a transmission medium. But you have the same result. It's a point-to-point connection. What we have here is basically a certain kind of gene will basically produce a transcription factor, and that transcription factor protein there'll be millions and millions manufactured. It's like a transmission medium that will bind point to point to specific transcription factor binding sites on specific genes and cis regulatory modules, you see. So in the same way, you have a kind of landline transmitting point to point. You have, in the same way, you also have analogous to a mobile phone, a transmission medium. These genes basically like have a point-to-point connection with other genes. So you can see how a gene regulatory network is like a neuronal network. So you see in principle how you can wire up these genes and transcription factors to basically make these like a neuronal network, like gene regulatory networks. So we can go on, but you see, like a brain, at the end of the day, all these neurons firing have to activate arms and legs. So it's like you have this, you have a hierarchical arrangement of genes, and you have a hierarchical arrangement of neurons. So I need to mute? How do I mute? I need to mute not myself. I need to mute all participants, don't I? How do I do that? I need to mute. Okay, can I ask everyone to mute themselves? Because everyone to mute, mute. Okay, so I need to mute everybody. I've forgotten how to do it. Okay, anyway. So basically, you see in principle how, once you see a gene as a little neuron with like little dendrites inputting and little axons outputting, you can see how you can wire it up in a hierarchical way. So in exactly the same way that the kind of primary motor cortex is where your behavior comes out, your arms and legs move and your mouth moves and stuff, that's behavior, that's the bottom of the hierarchy. So the bottom of the genetic, gene hierarchy, the genome hierarchy, essentially those are genes which make metabolic enzymes and structural proteins. That's the output, that's the end result. But you see, there's a hierarchy of genes, and there's also a hierarchy in the brain. And the analogy goes further. In the same way, the brain has this recursive nesting architecture, kind of neurons in cortical columns and macro columns in cortical patches. You have the same nesting arrangement with genes. You have exons within a gene and multiple splicing. Okay, so one gene can make many proteins. And then you have basically genes in gene batteries nested together. You have batteries of batteries nested together. So the analogy between like the brain and the genome is not superficial. It actually is very, very kind of explicit, and it goes all the way to a kind of almost like a one-on-one mapping between the genome and the brain. Now that's an actual diagram of a specific kind of. It's basically a cell adhesion molecule protein, and this is an actual kind of loopome, and the blue bars are cis regulatory modules, and that's the actual transcribing site. So that's an actual protein. It's just a little more complex. But I mean, this is the extreme case because there's like 15 cis regulatory modules, but generally there's about kind of half a dozen, 2 or 3 kind of that kind of number. But see, it's kind of complex. But anyway, I mean, so a gene has a neuron. So genes, like neurons, fire off probabilistically. So in the same way that we described these regulatory modules on a dendrite as doing disjunction, doing a kind of combinatorial symmetry logic, in the same way, these cis regulatory modules do the same. And we described the axon point-to-point connection like happening with transcription factors. In the same way, neurons can have inhibitory and excitatory connections. These connections between cis regulatory modules can be promoters or silencers. They can inhibit, they can also enhance. Now, okay, I mean, you get the picture. Obviously, the brain and the genome is really, really complex, but you get the gist in principle how, if a brain is made of neurons linked up, you can see in principle how genes working like neurons can link up into gene regulatory networks that are like neuronal networks, and also to link up to make a genome that's like an entire brain. Okay, so that's another talk. That's another 2-hour talk for another day. We go into all the details of the brain genome and show the one-to-one correspondence. But we're going to just go, we're going to the next level now, and just to really get the kind of the main message of the talk in, which is the recursive self-modification. Okay, we move to the next part of the diagram, which is to show how development and ontogenesis, thought and behavior, are essentially the same thing. Now this sounds really outlandish because, okay, thought and behavior, you got arms and legs moving around, you kind of like your mouth moving, that's behavior, isn't it? You're walking around and stuff. And when you have thoughts in your mind, that's something in our introspection, but that seems a world away from ontogenesis, which is basically what a genome computes. If a brain computes thoughts and behavior, then a genome is computing ontogenesis, i.e. a fertilized egg becomes a body, becomes a brain, becomes organisms. The trick is to show that there's an underlying code, there's an underlying invariant aspect or symmetry that is not obvious. But once you see it, you see basically there's a certain pattern which pertains to absolutely everything in ontogenesis and absolutely everything to do with thought and behavior. We're going to show you what that is, and what it is essentially back to our binary trees. So we're going to screen share again. So we've gone back to our binary trees, okay, to we talked about earlier. Now, just to help you visualize, okay, you see that that's a binary branch. I've rotated. That's a binary branch. I can make that branch again to make little squares. You see, so I use binary trees to represent a 2D grid. And at the bottom, I can keep recursively subdividing to make more complex, high-resolution 2D grids. So I can use binary trees to represent space, to represent 2D space. Okay, so binary trees are really powerful. And I can also use binary trees to represent time or linked lists. So this is basically the same kind of grids I had earlier on. But what I've done now is basically I've used this binary tree to represent time. So there's 8 time intervals represented by what's called a balanced binary tree. Okay, so this is 8 time intervals. It could be seconds, it could be microseconds, it could be any demarcation of time. Now this is another kind of binary tree called an unbalanced binary tree. It's more like a linked list, isn't it? So basically there's the same thing, but you can see it's like a binary tree, like binary tree. Now the interesting thing is that this way of representing lists and also representing 2D planes this way of representing 2D planes is exactly how the latest and greatest video compression technology called H.265, actually there's a new one called H.266, they use this method. I mean, H.265 uses exactly this, what's called a quad tree method of demarcating the 2D video frame. And H.266, the one that came out last year, uses a variant with some extra bits added on. And this way of representing lists or time is exactly how the programming language Lisp, one of the first programming languages that was designed, and it was also designed for artificial intelligence. It's how Lisp represents lists in exactly this binary conjugating way, conjugating a head of a tail and sort of head of a list and a tail of a list. So that's interesting. That's an interesting aside, a kind of like very elegant way, very elegant correspondence with computer science. Okay, so we've just drawn this again in a kind of flattened 2D plane, the same kind of like a binary tree representing a grid, and just to make it more biological and more kind of like flexible, the language is literally accommodates the basic symmetry transformations, slide, scale, rotate, and even reflection we saw earlier. So it's in this little kind of bit of code I hacked up my phone. It's actually, I don't know how it comes across over Zoom because it's high resolution video from my phone. But can you see it's the same binary tree, but it's kind of shifting, recursively sliding, shifting, and also scaling. So it scales. And it rotates. So you see, it's a flexible language. It's literally rotating, flexing, etc. But it's I don't know, it's not coming up very well because the Zoom is low res, and this is a very high resolution screenshot from my phone. Okay, so anyway, there's it's rotating and it's kind of shifting, shimmering. This is actually not. I put this in from my old phone because it's lower resolution. That probably shows up better, doesn't it? So it's the same kind of idea. You basically have that same grid, but it's kind of like, it's a flexible language. So just keep that in mind because it's a really kind of like a flexible language that's very suitable for kind of practical applications. Okay, now we're going to apply what we've just said, and we're going to basically go through all the major aspects of, we're going to go through like a skimming stone. Okay, so we're going to cover like a load of ground, and we're going to basically show that the main aspects of ontogenesis and the main aspects of thought and behavior, they all decompose the binary trees. I know this sounds like a shocking thing. It's not obvious, but when I show you, it becomes crystal clear. Okay, obviously mitosis, all the 15 trillion cells in your body came about through mitosis. You started off as a fertilized egg, and that egg keeps subdividing to 2 and to 4 and to 6, 8 and 16, and it's going on in your body right now, this mitosis process. Okay, that's kind of basic biology. Now, what's not so obvious is what's called progenitor fields. Actually, I've skipped that diagram. We're going to avoid a bit of a. Now, let me stop the screen share so I can maybe. Now, basically, you have these kind of cell division causes kind of all the cells in your body to form, but these cells must differentiate because these cells must kind of basically produce. Basically all the different parts of your body, and all the different parts of your body have different transcription factor patterns. So it somehow must differentiate. So what happens is you have these kind of pluripotent cells, but they must basically specialize, recursively specialize into all the specialized parts of your body. And the way it does is through a kind of binary process. Now, it has been thought that there is this kind of like trifurcating process going on, but it's now understood it's really not the case. I mean, for instance, Brian Goodwin, who's an influential developmental biologist, he basically calls ontogenesis or morphogenesis, fertilized egg becomes your body. He basically described it as a bifurcation diagram. So this is obviously a schematic. You have basically the original progenitor field up here where I'm waving my cursor. And you basically, the bifurcation diagram basically produces all the specialized parts of your body, and it's for a bifurcating process. So it's always binary branching. There is a mechanism that actually enables this to happen, but I won't explain it because it takes about 5 minutes to explain. That's the gene machinery which does it. And so basically, there's a very exact mechanism which actually causes this cell, kind of progenitor field formation process involving billions, millions of cells to subdivide into 2 groups. Okay, and also influential developmental biologist, Oxford professor called James D. Murray, has written a very influential tome called Mathematical Biology. It's actually standard PhD postdoc reading for kind of like developmental biologists. And he explicitly says that basically it's very hard to get a trifurcation, i.e. a three-way branch going reliably, even in a computer simulation. So it seems if you really want a kind of a certain kind of structure in your life form that's kind of very reliable to produce, and that can be kind of like reproduced over many generations reliably without error, then really bifurcation and this kind of digital bifurcating like technique is really the way to go. Okay, so that's progenitor field formation. Now, the Nobel Prize winning work, where basically this is basically the long axis of a fruit fly embryo. So basically, a fruit fly, the egg becomes like a subdivided in this kind of over time. Can you see? So to the left of the diagram, what's happening is basically over time, the fruit fly Drosophila genome, the DNA is laying down these chemical markers. Can you see these chemical marks over time? It's a binary divisioning process. I've actually drawn in a binary tree over those divisions. What it means is basically you're laying down a kind of like superimposing a chemical map, and basically in combination, when you use all those chemicals together, you have basically a combinatorial code that lets you specify any point or any rough point on the long axis of the fruit fly. So it means the genome has have a sense of space, doesn't it? Because it needs to allocate arms, legs, antenna in the right place. But how it's doing it is through this kind of binary subdivisioning code. Okay, so you see it's binary sub-demarcating the kind of long axis of the fruit fly using this binary code. Okay, keep that in mind because we're going to show that's exactly how the human brain also demarcates space and time. Okay, so look. The next one is basically, there's an algorithm by which how arms and limbs and tetrapods form. So basically arms and limbs, tetrapods is basically frogs and newts, fish even, right up to human beings. You have basically a condensation, which is like a progenitor field. And you have this algorithm. Basically, the algorithm goes, you have a condensation that can branch into a kind of binary branch. Can you see? There's like we had before, this kind of like branching, bifurcating diagram. Now, when you have this state, you can also apply this rule here. We can actually break off a bit. If you break off a bit, then we're back to one, aren't we? You recursively apply these rules to the bottom of the diagram, whereby we've basically, what we've done is we've basically kept reapplying those rules to essentially generate the basic pattern of basically tetrapod arms and legs. The basic pattern preserved from fish onwards is basically this idea of, okay, your upper arm is one bone, two bones, lots of bones, digits. That's the repeating pattern preserved all through evolutionary history. So it's a very basic binary algorithm. That's the main thing. And from that algorithm, you stretch, you heterosynchrony, you allometric scale, you stretch, you bend, and then you cause that basic algorithm to cause a human arm and leg, cat paw, bat wing, whale flipper, etc. You see, very kind of like a powerful algorithm. But it's binary. That's the main thing. It's a binary algorithm, binary branching, binary segregating, breaking a bit off. Okay, so that basically covers ontogenesis. Okay, we're going to, like a skimming stone, now go over the same thing with aspects of thought and behavior, and show that the same binary pattern also pertains to essentially all the elements of thought and behavior. Now spatial mapping, like the genome, basically we subdivide the space recursively into left and right, recursively. Okay. Sometimes we learn how things work when they go wrong. And there's this thing called Hemi Neglect, where part of your right parietal cortex is lesioned, is destroyed for some reason. And you literally lose half your world. Okay, so a person with Hemi Neglect will try and draw this house, but he loses half the world. He can't draw the left side of the house. He's asked to draw a clock, and basically he can't seem to put the digits into the left side of the clock. Same with a flower. He basically reads a word. He can't seem to read the left side of the word. Now, he's asked to walk down the street where he lives, and as he's asked to imagine walking down the street where he lives. Okay, so basically he walks down the street. He's asked what's on your right-hand side, and he can recall what's on the right-hand side. He's asked what's on the left-hand side. He hasn't got a clue. He's asked to walk to the end of the street in his imagination, turn around the other side 180 degrees. Now he's walking the other way. Now he can recall the stuff on the other side of the street that he couldn't recall. Now it's totally forgotten, or can't seem to recall what he recalled previously. Okay, this is so funny. It's a strange condition. Okay, asked to eat a plate of food. Basically, he starts eating a plate of food, and then when we get to number 2, he basically stops eating. You rotate the plate of food 180 degrees, he starts eating again. and you get the picture, you rotate again, he stops eating. So he basically lost half his world. There's another kind of Hemi Neglect, which is like a multi-resolution Hemi Neglect. So basically, that's normal. This is called microsaccades. It's basically when you fixate on something, your eyes scan very, very quickly. They're called microsaccades. And so this is a normal person can scan every single dot in this diagram. And this is like the previous diagram. We've lost half your world. There's a condition where basically, if you lesion specific parts of your brain, you have like a higher resolution variety of kind of neglect. Now, if you divide, see the medium scale diagram, if you divide that into two, what's happened here is that the patient, you see, he's lost half of the half. Can you see the red dots is where his eyes can go? They only go to the right half of each half of the diagram. Can you see? And then when you on a fine scale, when you subdivide the diagram, the 4 equal quadrants, okay, then the patient with a different lesion to a different part of the brain has basically lost half of each quadrant. You see, it's nuts, isn't it? Basically, the scan can only go to 1/2 of each quadrant and actually neglects the other half. So that's kind of multi-resolution kind of Hemi Neglect. Okay, another doubling phenomenon in the brain is basically our eyes, our retinas process the brain, process visual input in terms of what's called spatial frequency. So let me show you what spatial frequency is. So these are spatial frequency gratings. Can you see spatial frequency? You see the sine wave going across the diagram. Underneath is the spatial frequency corresponding to the kind of sine wave because it's mapped out in space. That's 1 octave higher. And that's 2 octaves higher than number 1. What they found in a kind of, this is another diagram showing spatial frequency gratings at different orientations. Okay, so what they found, stop the screen share for a bit. What they found in this paradigm called just noticeable difference is that what they found is basically the subject is asked to look at a kind of spatial frequency grating at a certain frequency, and then over time, several minutes, it's as if the retina, the primary visual cortex or whatever, will tire out and basically become less sensitive to that frequency. But what they found is basically if you move that spatial frequency grating 1 octave above, or have another spatial frequency 1 octave below, i.e. you double the frequency and you halve the frequency, then the tiring effect is gone. What it shows is basically it's almost as if the brain is like an octave bandpass filter. And you can actually segregate out each bandpass, octave bandpass filter by tiring out with this just noticeable difference kind of paradigm. It just means that there's kind of halving the frequency, doubling the frequency effect again in the spatial frequency gratings. Okay, so back to screen share. Find the right diagram. Okay. So we move on, just like a skimming stone kind of like survey of all things to do with the brain, thought, and behavior now. Now that's my daughter kind of riding a balance bike over a hexagonal grid. So this reflects the kind of Nobel Prize winning work from 2014, that as you kind of move across physical space, then it's also your brain maps a kind of hexagonal grid on the floor. Or a grid of equilateral triangles. It's like basically you have this kind of grid, and as you move across it, brains in your dentate gyrus and your hippocampus will light up when you're close to the center of the hexagons. Okay, so now these hexagonal grids that your brain projects somehow on the floor, okay, they come in various scales. They come in particular sizes. You can see this is drawn as equilateral triangles, which are the center of hexagons. These neurons, different neurons in the brain will fire maximally when you're in the center of each of these kind of like kind of equilateral triangle hexagonal grids. But these grid sizes come in certain sizes. Can you see that's a big grid size, that's a small one, and you've got a very fine mesh grid size. Now there's a scaling factor between the grid sizes. The scaling factor is 1.42. Now that's significant because 1.42 is the square root of 2. So you multiply by 1.42 twice, you double or you divide by that and you basically halve. Again, this halving, doubling frequency, even with grid cells that we map onto the floor. Now, brainwaves, I mean, on an EEG, brainwaves are all over the place. I mean, really are like really scattered around, but we have like a kind of surface electrodes. Say human beings have their brains open up for surgery. for epilepsy, say, then the brainwaves are very, very phase precise, very, very kind of regular. So the gamma wave is so regular, basically it's caused by the kind of refractory period of a receptor called gamma aminobutyric acid. And it has a kind of like refractory period of 25 milliseconds. So it rests for 25 milliseconds and it activates again, and it activates after another 25 milliseconds. So it causes a very precise 40 hertz wave. And you also find that theta waves, say the 5 to 6 hertz, it's again very precise, and actually use the phase of the theta wave to represent data. So you can actually, the waves are very precise, and the phase of the waves, the phases of the wave is also very precise, because spike timing in relation to that theta wave actually encodes very, very important information. Okay, so the important thing is that basically these most fundamental brain waves in your brain, they come again in powers of 2. So gamma waves are roughly 40 hertz, beta waves roughly 20 hertz, alpha waves roughly 10 hertz, and theta waves roughly 5 to 6 hertz. Okay, and then if we draw a binary tree through those those waves, what we have here is what's called wavelets. We've basically divided these waves into these powers of 2 kind of waves that we can segregate into these kind of wavelets. Now, in the brain, they're actually used for a very practical purpose. So in speech processing, what was a kind of like suspected has been confirmed. What was suspected for a very long time was phonemes, okay, the very micro features of our speech. It was suspected, but confirmed about 10 years ago. Okay, that phonemes are processed using gamma waves. The gamma waves are like little buckets that chop up your phonemes into little processing buckets. And also what was suspected for a long time was also confirmed roughly 10 years ago, that theta waves are used for syllable processing. Okay, the interesting thing is that when speaker and listener are in agreement, okay, then their brain waves will synchronize up. They'll actually have synchronized brain waves. And one of the reasons is because the speech apparatus which produces speech and the kind of listening apparatus that processes the speech both use the same waves. So as I'm moving my mouth now, it's basically, you know, these theta wave, alpha wave, beta wave, gamma waves moving my mouth, and it's the same brain waves transcribing the signal in your ears. Okay, and if people are really listening, then the waves kind of synchronize up. As we go up the speech hierarchy, again, like language, you know, all language can be decomposed into binary trees. Okay, binary trees, but that doesn't sound very synchronous, does it? I mean, but this is how the brain kind of like chops up language into binary trees. You know, all kind of like, you know, brains think that's a binary tree. Brains think. Fractal brains think binary because it's a more complex binary tree, and the more complex binary tree way thinks fractal brains think binary. That is a kind of binary decomposition of language. Now music, there's something about music, okay, kind of common time classical music, pop music, rock music, folk music, nursery rhymes, limericks. There's a certain structuring of the beats. So 4 beats grouped into 8 beats, 8 beats grouped into 16 bits, 16 bits into 32 bits, 32 bits into 64, beats, not bits, beats. It's this kind of grouping of the beats in these kinds of music, which are popular, and also things which are easy to process, like limericks and nursery rhymes. The simple proposition here is that pop music, folk music, and rock music is popular because it's easy to process. And nursery rhymes are so appealing to little infants because it's easy for the brain to process. It's easy for the brain to process because the brain is working in this binary decomposing way. Okay, so we can go on. It's just to show that basically in all these aspects of ontogenesis and in all these aspects of thought and behavior, there is this binary grid kind of phenomena. Binary kind of like bifurcating, doubling, halving, octaving the frequency phenomena that we can completely capture using our binary tree language. Okay, so it means there's this underlying invariant aspect or symmetry underlying thought behavior and ontogenesis. Now we move on to the top of our diagram, which is basically to show that evolution is exactly as learning and creativity. Now, this is where we come to and establish an already kind of like an idea which is already, you know, out there. It's the idea of MEMS. It's the idea of neural Darwinism. It's the idea of genetic algorithms, genetic learning, etc., genetic programming. It is the idea that somehow evolution is happening in the brain and the human mind and has to do with intelligence. So this is a very established idea. but we're going to put up more firm foundations and show it's not one of relationship of analogy. It's actually a symmetry. It's actually the same thing. Okay. So let me explain. I'm going to stop screen share because I'll basically just be talking about this. Anyway, look. So you have this. So basically, you have this evolutionary process, and basically. Okay, David Eagleman, who is a neuroscientist, he's a very famous neuroscientist from his work, his TV work. He wrote a book with Anthony Brandt called Runaway Species. It's about human creativity. And what they said, their punchline in that book is basically human creativity breaks down into kind of three operations. Those operations are break, blend, and bend. Okay, break, blend, and bend. And the point here is that basically all these operations in human creativity also happen in evolution and biology. So in evolution and biology, we obviously we kind of blend. Okay, so basically we genetic crossovering, we mix our genes together, and that creates variation. So our kids are a mixture of both of us. And basically that is a creator of variety and variation for evolution to work on. And also, as we saw earlier, the kind of like the kind of basic arms and legs program, creating whale fins and bat wings, cat paws, and human arms and legs. That is bending, isn't it? Stretching and bending. Okay, so that's another mechanism that reflects human creativity. And as for breaking, you have basically genes are broken up, then reassembled. And so breaking and blending and bending is what goes on in biology. Now, when we go to the specifics of biological evolution, again, we can cross over to human creativity. So a point mutation or a gene insertion deletion, you might play, tricky guitar solo. I played loads of notes wrong, but the wrong version sounds better than the original. Okay, so that's an example of point mutation, or you change a word in a poem and the change sounds better. So that's another example of a kind of point mutation happening in human creativity. And the idea, like this is another mechanism of evolution. It's called whole genome duplication. You duplicate the entire genome. And an example of this is like the idea that great artists steal and lesser artists borrow. You basically, human creativity, you absorb a body of work, a technique, or you basically you duplicate the entire technique in high school or art school, and or you steal someone else's ideas and you modify those ideas. So that's an example of whole genome duplication happening in human creativity. And there's this very important mechanism. It's called retrotransposition. Okay. Now, most primate evolution is believed to come about through retrotransposition. Let me explain what retrotransposition is. Retrotransposition is copy and paste. You take a little segment of DNA, you copy, and you paste it to another part of the DNA. So it's copy and paste. And it's believed that over 50% of the human genome is made from retrotransposed elements. So this copy and pasting mechanism is really powerful and has driven most of primate evolution. Now, in terms of human creativity, I mean, modern computer sampling and a lot of human creativity is literally copying and pasting. Okay, but this has happened all through history. People steal bits of artistic technique or steal bits of riffs and music from different artists, and they basically copy and paste into their own work. Okay, so what it means is that all these kind of transformations of kind of human creativity happen in the world of genomics, but vice versa. Go back to screen share. All the transformations of biology also happen in creativity. Vice versa, all the transformations of human creativity happen in biology to human creativity. So go back to the diagram. It means basically there is this kind of correspondence between all the transformations of evolution and human creativity and learning. But when we understand that those transformations are working on the same abstract structure as the thought and behavior and development, then you realize that abstract structure common to thought, behavior, and development is actually on a substrate which also has a symmetry relationship. You see, we kind of like established the idea that evolution and learning creativity somehow have this very tight relationship or firmer grounds. In fact, we show that throughout this entire diagram, there is a kind of corresponding relationship across the diagram to show that there really is this kind of symmetry relationship between life and intelligence. Okay. what I think we'll do now is basically just have a short break. If you want to make a cup of tea, or if you want to stop the screen share, we're just going to take a short 10-minute break for questions and answers before we go to the next part of the talk, which is really where the real kind of the recursive self-modification stuff is. So let us just break for 10 minutes, and we'll basically take 10 minutes of Q&A if people want to go to the toilet, make cups of tea, but we'll start fairly promptly in about 10 minutes time. So about 15:15, we'll start again. And we'll not do like in the last talk where the Q&As went for like an hour, and then the talk began again. So we're basically going to start. Anyway, does anyone have any questions?
Hi, Wei. Can you hear me?
Hi, Ollie. Hi. Great to see you.
Yeah, you too. I haven't been around for a little while, but
you've had local government elections, I know.
Well, no, that's not my area actually. It's in different areas that have been doing that, but yeah, it's some excitement around that. Okay, so I want to go back to like maybe one of the first things you were saying about neurons being created in this region of the brain, and so we're used to like functions of the brain, like connections and synaptical activity, sort of correlating to ideas being strengthened, right? And so there's that like there's an aspect of ideation that is correlated with the sort of physical neuronal activity. Christ, to listen to me. Now, is there a psychological correlation with the creation of new neurons, and like yeah, I'll leave it at that, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, okay. Actually, if I go back to speaker view. Okay. Well, the thing is about these new neurons. Okay, they're developed in the actually walls of the ventricles in the brain. They migrate to this part called dentate gyrus in the hippocampus. Now, the important thing to know about the hippocampus, if you have a sensory hierarchy from your primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, going up a kind of hierarchy, a pyramid of hierarchy, then at the top of that hierarchy is the hippocampus. Okay, this is essential for forming memories. So in a sense, at the top of the kind of input hierarchy is, okay, there is the CA1 region, but the dentate gyrus, in a sense, is the binding region, it's believed. That's where the cross-association happens, is where these memories are bound together. So I'd say, yes, I mean, in answer to the question, we're actually going to answer in full in the next section of the talk, actually. There is a physical binding that these new neurons do, because it actually, where they exist is at the top of this essentially binding hierarchy. So now I said that these dendritic patches over tiny bits of dendrite, what they do essentially is compositional learning. Okay, was essentially what backpropagation neural networks, dominant kind of way of doing machine learning now in the world, has immense difficulty doing. But with this new understanding, we basically show that the entire brain is one great big compositional hierarchy, from the level of dendritic patches to the entire neuron to, patching, kind of compositing different sensory modalities in the hippocampus. So you think about it, what are memories? What are memories? You're basically compositing sensory data, aren't you? I walked down the street, I saw this and I saw that and I saw this, I met that person, so-and-so person. You're basically compositing atoms of sensory perception together to form these memories. So what these new neurons are doing is essentially binding in space in a sense. You're basically compositing together kind of these memories in the hippocampus. But Oliver, let me answer the rest of your question in the next part of the talk, because we'll talk exactly about the strengthening of memories, because we talk about this algorithm called differentiate, select, amplify. And we showed that this universal algorithm is exactly amplifying, memories and stuff in all these different kinds of ways. So I actually answered the rest of your question in the next part of the talk in the beginning of it. Okay, so
awesome. Yeah, thanks.
So anyone have any more questions?
Ray, I have a question. Mario?
Mario, great.
This goes back to the images you showed on the diffraction pattern with sound and how you're able to, when it comes to the visual cortex, based on the grid, I don't know if it was your child or your wife, based on the grid, how the eye is able to focus when the target is at a focal point somewhere within that vector.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder if there's a principle of quadrature being applied in the visual cortex. I recently built a grid similar to what you displayed, except fractally structured. And I'm using it for quadrature modulation and frequency modulation for a synthetic phased array.
Right. Well, Mario, did you know, I mean, personally, this is exactly what I think is going on in the brain. There's this binary subdivisioning process going on. You know, funny thing, I mean, you have wavelet transforms, you know, basically you have the mathematical formalism, but in real life, what you're using is quadrature filters. That's what they call them. Basically have this, you know, kind of like a quadrature subdividing of the visual plane. And in each quadrant, you apply the wavelet transform. Are you familiar with that? Well, anyway, that's how it's done. That's how basically these wavelet transforms, like wavelet 2000, JPEG 2000, that's how it's done. So basically, like we believe that the way the brain is subdivided is exactly as a quadrature filter, in the sense that these orthogonal axes, they're actually really important in the brain. So we think that there is this kind of, you know, you saw the Drosophila fruit fly, how the long axis of the fruit fly was binary subdivided, that Nobel Prize winning work, using this kind of binary doubling chemical signature. Well, the same idea applies to the other axis, where you can actually create a kind of chessboard of demarcation to actually, you know, essentially demarcate space. But that in a sense is a recursive quadrature. Do you get it? Kind of like a demarcating of 2D space. And we believe the cerebral cortex is exactly as that. And we find that these orthogonal axes are exactly expressed in the cerebral cortex and have meaning. That actual wiring of the cerebral cortex is basically, it's like a American street grid. It's orthogonal axes, essentially. We think that these orthogonal axes are basically quadranted in this kind of very precise way. So we think that's exactly what's going on in the brain, Mario. Okay, does anyone have any more questions?
This is Matt. I've got a question.
Great, Matt.
Yeah, so based on this new understanding of neurons, how does that new understanding translate to improved AI? Is there any way you can give like a short answer for that?
Oh man, this was really the subject of November's talk, which is on YouTube, my YouTube channel. So I mean, check out the that video. One of the things, it takes some explaining. The new model of the neuron, okay, is actually a microcosm of an entire person. And that sounds outlandish. Well, basically, it has a real effect on really on the way machine learning and artificial intelligence is done. For this very powerful reason. Okay, I can give a 2-hour talk. I did give a 2-hour talk in November all about this. Okay, but this in a nutshell, this is it. There is a most fundamental algorithm, AI. So the most fundamental algorithm, I can say it because the most influential textbook on AI, it is Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell's AI, a modern approach. Basically 95% of all MSc, PhD courses use this textbook in the English-speaking world. That most fundamental algorithm is described again and again in the kind of first 12 chapters. And it's basically the basic algorithm crops up in kind of kind of game search theory, in kind of logical calculus, in robot situational calculus. The basic algorithm is basically a forward search into a space of possibilities, and it's a backward chain to a goal. So the goal might be, you know, checkmate, and the forward chain is the positions of your chess pieces now, and you forward chain, and you go back from all the, you know, end games, and where it intersects, that's your answer basically. The robot's here, your robot needs to be there, you backward chain, you forward chain, and then basically that's the basic algorithm. But essentially, that is what a neuron is doing. You see, the dynamic axon is forward chaining. It's exploring into combinatorial space. And the backward chain is the dendrite. This kind of backward chaining effect I described earlier, from the cell body to these kind of, like cis regulatory, these dendritic patches, etc., backward chaining. So essentially, the neuron is fundamentally, each neuron is fundamentally implementing the most fundamental algorithm in artificial intelligence. That's powerful, isn't it? It's not, kind of spokes of a wheel, linear summation, sigmoid activation function. That's just complete nonsense. The second thing is the most fundamental idea in machine learning. Okay, so Pedros Domingos is a professor of machine learning, wrote a very good book called Master Algorithm. And he in his view of things, a professor of machine learning, he thinks that the most fundamental idea is tuple formation. So okay, if you have one factor, you can use that to predict things, can't you? And then he's saying basically you have a tuple, a kind of n tuple, like two factors together, you can predict better. And if you conjugate 3 factors, 4 factors, 5 factors, then you're forming tuples. That's conjugation. That's basically what's happening over these dendritic patches. Then he's saying what you need is then disjunction, like disjunctive normal form logic. You basically take those conjunctions, you have disjunctions of conjunctions, which is exactly what's happening over a neuron, because you have neuronal branches, like OR cases between different dendritic patches. What it means is the most fundamental idea in machine learning and most fundamental idea in artificial intelligence is actually being implemented by each individual neuron. So that in itself is a revolution in a way of looking at, looking at artificial intelligence. There's also, it takes some explaining, but there's also a way of looking how an entire neuron is actually a microcosm of a person. Okay, so that takes a bit of explaining, but I hope I've said enough to show you the potential of this new way of looking at neurons, actually grounded on the way neurons actually work. So people are saying all these puzzles of that they're having difficulty with compositional learning, the troubles with gradient descent, the answers are right there in the neuroscience. It's actually grounded in actual empirical research. Okay, anyway, I think we'll move on just to, we'll have more time for questions at the end, but we'll just basically move on to the next and just get to the punchline, which is recursive self-modification. Okay. So the next section is about screen share back again. So look, the next section is about the overall process of the brain. Okay, so what is the unifying algorithm of the brain? So what we think is basically what we believe is that, okay, let me tell you a simple truth about your life. Everything in your life has emanated from a fertilized egg. So basically, there's a critical point in your life where an egg was fertilized, and everything in your life has emanated from that. Everything you've done, every kind of like random neuron firing, every protein that's ever been manufactured in your body has emanated from that point, that singularity of a fertilized egg. If that didn't happen, nothing in your life would have happened. So what we think is that basically there's a single chain of causality from that point of fertilization to everything that's ever happened in your life. Okay, so there's a single chain of causality. So what we think is that there's a single process, therefore, from that fertilized egg and a single chain of causality. We believe it's a single algorithm. That sounds wild, doesn't it? We think there's a single algorithm between the point of fertilization and the fertilized egg and everything that's ever happened in your life. Now, we've gone some way to show this, to show the kind of symmetry between ontogenesis and thought and behavior with this kind of underlying binary tree structure. But now we're going to describe what the actual process is. And I'll tell you what the process is. Now the first section of the talk, we ended with evolution. Basically, we'll start with evolution. Now, what is the process of evolution? So, people study complexity theory or even systems theory. In the abstract, they'll talk about evolution as an algorithm in this way. They'll say it's basically differentiate, select, amplify. It's a very powerful and all-encompassing way of looking at evolution. You're basically differentiating into variation, different variations of the same species that will eventually become different species. And from that you select. Obviously, select is natural selection, survival of the fittest, etc. But then you amplify. So amplify means basically those survivors will breed. Basically, the genes will propagate in the population, and that's amplification. So evolution is differentiate, select, amplify. But if we think about it, ontogenesis is also differentiate, select, amplify. So point 2 in the diagram, Okay, from a fertilized egg, basically, if these progenitor field forming, now some of these progenitor fields are basically selected for. They're literally amplified, and they get blood vessels, they get nutrients, and these bits of your body grow and develop, and they branch out more progenitor fields. And some of these progenitor fields are selected to die. So there's a kind of programmed pattern of differentiate, select, amplify that's been programmed by your genes, and that's been selected by evolution. But as we saw earlier, okay, point 3, as we saw earlier, axons, what are axons doing? Okay, they're actually running an algorithm. When you understand that basically the dynamic axons, they're exploring into space is actually part of what they're doing, then you realize that basically axons are differentiating, literally differentiating into space, and they will connect certain dendrites. And based on certain criteria of correlation, what's called spike time dependent plasticity, they will be selected. So you differentiate, they'll be selected according to specific criteria, and they'll be amplified, literally long-term potentiation amplified, the synapse will be strengthened. You see, so it's essentially the algorithm of neurons is essentially, again, it's differentiate, select, amplify. Now, behavior and thought, this is where we can use, again, the ideas of symmetry to understand behavior and thought. Because behavior is something external and thought is something internal. What's the symmetry? How is that one process? Well, let me explain. We have to go to a bit of neuroanatomy. And basically, okay, this diagram is basically the brain. That is your prefrontal cortex. And where I'm waggling my cursor, okay, kind of areas 4 and 6. Can you see 4 and 6? This kind of band here. That's your primary motor cortex. And behind it, the premotor area. And behind that's what's called the supplementary motor area and pre-supplementary motor area. Now, these are the parts of your brain to do with external behaviors. I mean, move your arms and legs about. Basically, that's what you're using. Now, that part of your brain is connected to a part of your brain, another part of your brain called the striatum. Can you see this? It blown up in green is your striatum. It's in the center of your brain. Now, years ago, when I started teaching myself about neuroscience about 30 years ago, all the textbooks, what the understanding of the striatum was basically that the understanding was that basically striatum meant primary motor cortex and premotor cortex. So all these textbooks, neurology textbooks, neuroscience textbooks, that was the understanding. That completely changed with in the past 20 years, really, 20, 30 years. It kind of started coming out in the kind of 90s, the revised picture. The revised picture is saying basically the striatal architecture pertains to the entire prefrontal cortex and even the emotion centers, the what's called the hypothalamus and the amygdala nuclei also have striatal areas. So when we talk about behavior, okay, there's a symmetry in terms of brain anatomy with thought and also even emotional responses. It's basically, there's the same underlying architecture and the same process being animated by these parts of the brain. Okay, so what is that process? We can look at external behavior and basically we can see that it is essentially external behavior is what's studied in this thing in machine learning called reinforcement learning. I'll just go to screen share again. Basically, reinforcement learning is about this, about using this kind of certain behaviors come out and you reinforce certain behaviors according to the ability to achieve reward or the ability to escape from aversion. Okay. Now, the reinforcement behavior learning paradigm crucially involves a chemical called dopamine. Okay, dopamine is this critical chemical that is involved with the striatum. The striatum needs dopamine to work. And it's also the chemical of addiction. So there's a specific part of your brain, your striatum called the nucleus accumbens, which is the pathway of addiction. And basically, it reinforces addictive behaviors. The crucial thing is that basically, as you behave, the idea of reinforcement learning is basically you can do all kinds of things. You can basically differentiate into all kinds of behaviors. But as you branch out and do all kinds of behaviors, only certain behaviors will be rewarded. And those behaviors are those behaviors which basically the criteria is basically unexpected reward. So basically, if you do something by routine and you've always expected a reward, then there's nothing to learn, is there? But if you do something and then you have an unexpected reward, okay, a contrived example, I'm walking down a street, okay, I like a tramp, I just do a random walk around London, okay, just a contrived example. And as I randomly walk around London, I differentiate, explore around London, I walk down a certain street and I find there's a £10 note there. Unexpected reward, dopamine flows, the dopamine literally rises in my brain. So unexpected reward, the dopamine rises. And then there's a circuit from your behavior centers and thinking centers into your stratum. And when the dopamine rises, literally the glutamate connections are strengthened by the dopamine rise. Okay, so literally the behavior of walking down that street and thinking about that street is reinforced, literally physically reinforced by the dopamine. Now, the criteria for weakening that connection is basically if there is disappointment. Okay, so I keep walking down, wandering around the streets of London. Obviously, that I keep tending to go back to that street to find £10 notes. Contrived example, I keep finding £10 notes in that street for some reason. So I keep walking down there. So I found like half a dozen £10 notes. So I'm rewarded to go back that street, reinforced behavior. Now, the criteria for dopamine to weaken a behavior is disappointment. So I'm walking down the street, I expect a £10 note. Now, disappointment, there's no £10 note. Okay, what happens then is that the dopamine literally falls. When the dopamine falls, the projections from the cerebral cortex into your stratum, coupled with falling dopamine, will actually weaken the synapse. So literally your behavior with repeated disappointment is kind of basically weakened. The main point is basically when we behave, it's basically differentiate into loads of different kinds of behavior, all the different streets in London I can walk down. You select certain ones that are rewarded, i.e. finding £10 notes, or for whatever reason you're rewarded for certain behaviors, and then it's amplified. You literally amplified through dopamine those behaviors. And because of this symmetry between the stratum subserving, go back to screen share, because of the symmetry of the stratum subserving these motor areas, which are to do with actual behavior, and the actual the idea is the idea that all these parts of your brain at the front, the prefrontal cortex, the polar frontal cortex, is to do with thought, thinking, language, etc. Basically, what we argued for external behavior also applies to thought and behavior, because it's basically underlying symmetry relationship in terms of the architecture, subserving thought, behavior, and actual physical movement, right up to your emotion centers. So what it means is basically that all thought and behavior is effectively differentiate, select, amplify. It's the same algorithm reinforced by dopamine. So this dopamine circuit essentially serves the entire brain, because even your sensory areas, which are not directly involved with the stratum, will feed into the stratum to kind of be auxiliary to the functioning of these stratal circuits. Okay, so I mean, that is the idea that that differentiate, select, amplify really is this universal algorithm. And then we come to the last part of this diagram, creativity and innovation, because we showed a symmetry already between evolution happening in biology and the evolution of behaviors. You see, it's the same process. It's differentiate, select, amplify. So there's a single branching kind of algorithm that starts from a fertilized egg right to ontogenesis, to what's going on in your brain, axons, dendrites moving around with thought, behavior, and all the creative actions that you do in your life as a single algorithm. Now, okay, we're going to take this theory much further, because we need to basically formalize to gain a deeper understanding. So we're going to shift the gear to move to a more abstract realm. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. So we need to discuss the nature of mathematics and science. Okay, so this is very, very crucial for understanding recursive self-modification. Okay, let me go through this diagram. Basically, okay, this is how science has been done for hundreds of years. Now, Tycho Brahe had lots of dots. He had astronomical observations, and it's Johann Kepler's job to join the dots, and he did it. And his innovation was elliptical orbits. Okay, that's his great innovation. Then along came René Descartes, and basically he came up with kind of analytical geometry. So you can now describe elliptical orbits using mathematical formula. Very clever. Then later on, it came Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who basically came up with differential calculus. So now you can see how the orbits, the dots, how they change in time. Okay, so basically that's the way science has been done for the past several hundred years. The dots have become much more complex. The calculus has become much more convoluted, you know, kind of like tensor calculus, Einsteinian calculus, quantum physics and all that kind of business. But essentially, it's the same kind of continuous mathematics, same kind of integration, same kind of differentiation. It's basically what's called this kind of traditional calculus. But the problem is this traditional calculus does not do discontinuous phenomena. It does not really do recursively nested structure. And that's the problem. I mean, this equation here almost looks like backpropagation, doesn't it? So basically there's troubles with the world of AI that they're sticking to this kind of traditional calculus. Now, the alternative is basically there is a ready answer, and it's called discrete mathematics. Okay, so let me explain what discrete mathematics is after a bit of history. One of the towering achievements of the 20th century, this is more kind of less known than quantum mechanics or general relativity, I think the other two major towering achievements of the 20th century, is Principia Mathematica. Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, really clever guys. Okay, Bertrand Russell won 2 Nobel Prizes. Very, very, very clever person. What Principia Mathematica does in 3 volumes, these are the dates the volumes came out, but they basically reduce all mathematics to set theory. Okay, so that's their great achievement. And later on, John von Neumann, the genius, reduce all set theory to a single sheet of paper for his MSc thesis or PhD thesis or something. Very all smart guys. Okay, now the thing about discrete mathematics, set theory includes discrete mathematics includes things like Boolean algebra, logic, etc. That's this discrete mathematics. One of the important things for our considerations is that basically all the relations of set theory and Boolean algebra, they're all binary. And the structures of Boolean algebra, logic, they're all basically binary structures. So all the nested parentheses of logic and Boolean algebra, there's basically binary trees expressed in linear format. You see, there's a close relationship between discrete mathematics and binary trees. And the thing about discrete mathematics, it is not something, it is simple, but it's really powerful because discrete mathematics can reduce all mathematics. Now, one of the things we do is basically we take the binary trees from earlier on, the kind of like the grids, you know, in the computer simulation, the kind of binary formal language, and we merge it with discrete mathematics, which is essentially binary trees. That's a kind of merger. But you see, we merge those shifty, scaly, rotatey, kind of like transpositional aspects of our mathematical language that kind of merges with computer science into this kind of formalism. But that is not our formalism. It gets to something far simpler. Okay, that is the manifestation of our abstract formalism, which is recursively self-modifying from a minimal seed. I'll tell you what a seed is in a minute. Okay, so you see aspects of the reduction of, okay, all the brain, neuroscience, all learning, all kind of stuff that happens in the genome into a binary language, into an abstract language called discrete mathematics. We'll take it even more abstract, even more simple in a minute. So let me screen share again. Okay, okay, traditional mathematics is great, but it's not quite doing the kind of new problems in biology and also in neuroscience. Okay, so we think something better is needed, and we think the answer lies with discrete mathematics. Now, okay, how does discrete mathematics relate to human language? We think that basically there is a convergence between human language and mathematics, because discrete mathematics distills into something even more simple called formal axiomatic systems, or formal systems, as it's known. So there's an even simpler distillation than set theory that all mathematics reduces, and these are called formal systems. Okay. Now, in the diagram, we have 2 very smart guys. I mean, very distinguished and smart guys. Now Noam Chomsky, obviously, he doesn't need any introduction. He's, very famous political dissenter, but his work at MIT was really linguistics. Okay, and he spent his entire working life. He doesn't really do much now, I guess. He's still alive. I mean, he's an amazing guy. His brain is still super sharp. Anyway, Noam Chomsky's work was to do with universal grammar, and this idea, it was basically the most minimal distillation of human language in its most abstract form, basically, in its most kind of like in the genes, kind of like most abstract distillation of all human language. And he had this idea called the strong minimalist thesis. What's the most minimal distillation of universal grammar? And we have this idea of the strongest possible minimalist thesis. What is it? Okay, so he never quite found a universal grammar. We think because he didn't quite understand the implications of what he was searching for. Or maybe he does. I mean, maybe we'll meet and we'll basically find out. Anyway, Gregory Chaitin, okay, he's another genius guy. Gregory Chaitin basically wrote a book called Meta Mathematics. It's all about formal axiomatic systems and this kind of deepest level of mathematics. He does a lot of work with Gödel's theorem. He proposed basically he proposed the idea of a most minimal formal axiomatic system, but also the idea that of a dynamic formal axiomatic system that can generate all the other formal axiomatic systems. Okay, so we believe, okay, that there is no demarcation between Chomsky's aim and Gregory Chaitin's aim, that there is a convergence between human language and mathematical language. Now, if you think about it, this must be the case. You think about it. There can never be a sharp demarcation between human language. Just let me stop screen share so I can. There can never be a sharp demarcation between human language on one hand and mathematical language on the other hand, for the simple reason that any mathematical language, you can say it in words, you can say it in human language. It might be very verbose, it might be very clumsy, but you can say it. What we think is the case as you go to the most minimal distillation of human language and the most minimal distillation of formal systems or formal axiomatic systems that can generate all the other formal axiomatic systems, you arrive at the same point. And we believe that the same point is also the most minimal distillation of this fractal genome, fractal brain, life equals intelligence symmetry theory. That essentially the expression of this kind of recursively self-modifying seed, okay, is one, it's life, but it's also language. That Chomsky, what he was searching for is essentially is something far deeper. When you understand the brain as a perfectly fractal symmetry architecture, then define the generator of language, okay, express language, is also define that key generator that's at the heart of human intelligence, also at the heart of the workings of the human genome and evolution. So he asked rhetorically, what's the nature of that recursive generative function that yields an infinite array of structured expressions? We think that same recursive algorithm yielding an infinite array of structured expressions is also yielding all life on this planet and all intelligence and all cultural artifacts. It's the same algorithm. Okay, so it gets deeper because we think that the convergence goes deeper. We think that what these mathematicians and linguists were asking after converges to a very ancient question. It's basically, it is a quest for a universal perfect language. And most people haven't heard of this, but really the kind of renowned Italian historian, Paolo Rossi, wrote a very good book called Art of Memory, The Quest for a Universal Language. And he describes basically how the work of a guy called Raymond Lull, who was a Catalan philosopher, who was hugely influential during the late medieval Renaissance period, right up to the Enlightenment, hugely influential. In a sense, Leibniz's work is derived from Raymond Lull. Isaac Newton had, all kind of Raymond Lull's books in his book collection in his library. So hugely influential. Anyway, Raymond Lull was made explicit this quest for a universal language. Okay, and he got it from the Arabs and probably goes way back to Egypt and ancient Greece. Anyway, the quest for a universal language was this thing which really influenced even René Descartes as well. Basically, I mean, he was questing for the universal language, but he came up with analytic geometry. Okay, so it's very influential. And once we understand that basically modern linguistics and a lot of kind of modern logic and discrete mathematics is really derived from Leibniz's work, then you see how influential this quest for a universal language and Raymond Lull's work really is. Okay, so let's go through this. There was very explicit descriptions of what this language involved that was described by Raymond Lull and people who came later, people like John Dee, people like Leibniz, what it had to be. Okay, so we think that the answer to the ultimate distillation of this life intelligence theory, and also what Chaitin and Chomsky are asking, is exactly the qualities of this universal perfect language. So it gets really deep now. Firstly, okay, it was believed to be simple. It's utterly simple. It could be learned in a day. And also, this universal perfect language has a intrinsic geometric character to it. So Leibniz admired, Gottfried Leibniz admired Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese characters because he said that basically they had this kind of geometric quality. But what it lacked was another point forward, the combinatorial quality of this universal language. So, you know, you need to learn 6,000 Chinese characters to read a newspaper, for Christ's sake. So it's something elegant and good about Chinese characters and hieroglyphics, but also something quite clumsy. But it is this geometric element that Leibniz admired. Okay, so there's something good about this geometric aspect. The third point is this implicit meaning. There's no dictionary needed for this language. The actual, what's written in this language has its own intrinsic meaning. It means what it means. There's no, here's the, an expression of the language. Here's the dictionary needed to decipher it. Somehow it has an implicit meaning. There's no dictionary for this language. Okay, point 4 is that it's combinatorial. Basically, it's compositional. You can composite stuff like English versus Chinese. So it has this geometric quality with this compositional quality. 5 is really important. The idea that this universal perfect language was generative. So Riemann Low was the guy who really brought this to European attention, that somehow it creates combinations, it somehow generates patterns. So Leibniz took his work further, and he basically came up with his calculus ratiocinator, from which modern logic and modern, kind of like even computation theory is derived from Leibniz's work. But in Leibniz's work was really derived from Riemann Low. So somehow, like grammars, it generates word. It can generate combinations. Okay, so it's actually a creative process, like evolution, like ontogenesis. Now, the sixth point is really important. This goes way back before Riemann Low of the monad. It goes way back. This is pre-Socratic. This is pre-Pythagoras. This is basically Anaximander. And it probably goes way back to ancient Egypt and kind of, lost in the mist of time and all kind of business. Anyway, the monad is one thing to which everything reduces, but it's one thing. So it has to be one single monad, and somehow that monad has to also generate everything in the perfect universal language. Okay, so we think that basically the criteria of the universal language is exactly the criteria necessary to distill this intelligence of life and this theory of life and intelligence. Okay, so let's start with monad and generative. If somehow this monad has to generate all these patterns, all these combinations, then it can only do it with itself because it's monad. Okay, so it has to be recursively self-modifying. Okay, so it's basically implicit in the idea of a monad generating all these combinations and all these geometric forms and being something simple, it has to do recursive self-modification. So what we think it is basically recursive self-modification is this idea of process giving rise to structure, but then that structure also encodes the process, which then feeds back on itself to create more structure, which then is encoding a process. That sounds wild and abstract until we recognize that basically everything in this diagram is, okay, so some of these things we think of as process, and some of these things we think of as structure. Obviously, a neuron is like a structure, and evolution is like a process, and creativity is like a process. But we've got to understand, everything in this diagram has that dual aspect of being process and structure. A neuron is basically like a structure, but it encodes a process. It's mapping signals from one end to another end. Now ontogenesis is a process, but it gives rise to structure, your body. Now evolution is a process, but it gives rise to the tree of evolution. It gives rise to this kind of shape in space and time. It's very complex, obviously, but it's a structure, isn't it? And your entire life, okay, your entire life is a process. I know it sounds a funny thing to say, but at the end of the day, you are a node on your family tree. That's what you are. Okay, you're like a process. You're unfolding your entire life from your birth to your grave. You end up as a node on a family tree, and each node is a mapping, a process from one node to another node. Okay, or not. I mean, so did you see everything in this diagram? It represents a mapping, a process, but it's also a structure. So it's okay, this dual aspect of process and structure is vital for understanding recursive self-modification. Now, in terms of generating structure, in order to explain this quite abstract principle to lay people, okay, so because a very diverse audience here, is this idea of basically what's called a Lindemayer system, which is we use to generate these plant forms. Okay, these don't exist in reality; these are computer generated. these are another examples of basically Lindemayer systems generating these plant forms. Okay, so basically it's a generative algorithm generating these plant forms. Okay, now the thing is, this is the algorithm. Okay, this is the algorithm. So what you have is basically in this part of the diagram, you have basically a certain set of variables. You have an axiom, and then you have these rules of construction. You apply these rules again and again to create these tree structures. Do you see? Now, the important thing about these rules, you see a little arrow, there's a little arrow there. Okay, so we think little arrows are really important, and a mathematician is going to roll their eyes, but we're going to make this explanation really simple so you can understand it. Little arrows are really important because little arrows represent mappings. It means that the left-hand side maps to the right-hand side. These Lindemayer systems are called string substitution systems, which are a very general thing. I mean, they apply to logic, mathematics, they're a very general thing. Anyway, here is another kind of Lindemayer system that generates this binary tree. You can see again, it's basically, these are the rules. Again, you got a little arrow, you have that pattern here, you can arrows to another pattern. And you recursively apply those rules and you generate this tree structure. Now, early on, we had this kind of like, this algorithm which generated arms and legs. It's the same principle. You have a little generative algorithm involving an arrow. The idea of an arrow, basically a mapping, can represent process, can also represent transformation. So basically, the idea of an arrow, one thing maps to another, can be used to represent any process, anything happening in time, and also any generative process, like we saw with the forming of trees and arms and legs, okay? But it's a very general concept, this idea of a little arrow, a little mapping. Basically, it maps onto lots of things, like a function is like a little arrow from the domain pointing to the range, etc. Logical implications, like a little arrow, logic gates, a little arrow, combinatorial logic, a whole bunch of combinations of ands and ors implicating a kind of answer, and etc. So the entire brain is a set of arrows, neurons mapping to another kind of like output signal, etc. Okay. What's important? Okay, what's important? Okay, so there's a whole branch of mathematics that's a contender for unified theory of all mathematics. It's called category theory. Okay, in a nutshell, category theory consists of little arrows called morphisms and little nodes called objects. So I'm talking about little arrows. It sounds utterly simple, doesn't it? But there's a whole branch of mathematics based on little arrows and compositing little arrows together, forming chains, conjugations of arrows to form composite arrows. And it's called category theory. And it's actually used a lot in computer science and also physics as well. And it's a very exciting area of research. But anyway, it's believed with category theory, it can decompose all mathematics. Okay. Anyway, we think that there is something akin to category theory in what we're doing. Let me explain. Now, in the first part of the talk, we decompose everything in this diagram can be decomposed into binary trees. We saw ontogenesis and thought behavior as binary trees, but the neuron is a binary tree. Okay, so a gene can be represented as a linked list as a binary tree. Now, okay, binary trees are really important. So if we're looking for basically the most minimal description of our theory, the strongest minimalist thesis of linguistics, the most minimal universal perfect language, then if we've described everything in binary trees, we can express all discrete mathematics with binary trees and all formal axiomatic systems using binary trees, then we want to go to the simplest thing possible. How do we do that? Okay, what's the simplest possible way to express a binary tree? Now, some of you people might be thinking, okay, the simplest way to express a binary tree is you start from the simplest binary tree, which is a binary branch. That's the simplest binary tree, isn't it? With a binary branch, you can create, you can keep joining binary branches and you make more complex binary trees. But well, I'll tell you, there's an even simpler way to encode binary trees. I'll tell you what it is. The most simple way you can encode a binary tree is not through a binary tree. You basically, not through describing binary branches. The simplest way to describe a binary tree, most minimal way to describe a binary tree, is by describing a binary tree walk. So here is a binary tree, and basically here in dash lines, I'm walking around a tree. It's a binary tree walk. Well, what is a tree walk? It's basically a little transition. It's a little arrow going from node to node. You see, as I use little arrows to go from node to node, basically I'm tracing out the binary tree. And I can take away the binary tree, but in the tree walk, I've encoded the binary tree. So basically, the most minimal description of a binary tree is a little arrow. Okay, so basically we want to take things in the most minimal. So in the sense we have one of the most minimal category theory. We don't even want nodes. We don't want we don't want objects. We just want arrows basically. Now, okay, so with this way of doing things, we can create binary trees of arbitrary infinite complexity, but that's not good enough. Okay, one of the elements we need is in formal axiomatic systems, we need an alphabet set. Okay, so what's the most simple letter? What's the most simple kind of like kind of alphabet set we can possibly have? It's 1 bit, and a 1 bit can be 0 or 1. Okay, so if we got this most minimal way of kind of describing binary trees by tree walking, if at each tree walk we can assign 0 or 1, okay, we can describe space along a binary tree, but we can also represent things now. You see, we can represent actually any pattern over that binary tree. What it means is that basically we take things to the most minimal in terms of binary trees, but the trick is now we feed back the output of our binary tree walking into itself. Okay, this is the recursive self-modifying bit. Okay, so look, here we have a normal function. So basically we describe a function in this way. So it's through a domain and range. This is basically high school mathematics. So with a domain and range, we can define any function. Now here's the trick. We basically take the function, we basically merge the domain and range. So basically we feed back the result into itself, which means as we use this kind of minimal category theory, minimal description of binary generating algorithm to generate little binary trees, we basically, the output of that algorithm becomes the input for the next generation of binary tree generation, which means that the algorithm is recursively modifying itself and it's becoming more and more complex. Okay, and I know that sounds really abstract, so I'm going to get more kind of like concrete now. Okay, so that's pretty abstract, isn't it? We're going to get really, really concrete. This process is happening in evolution. I'll show you in a concrete way why. It's a very old idea that evolution evolves evolvability. That basically evolution is basically recursively self-modifying algorithm. That evolution evolves evolvability. I'll show you a very simple way that evolution evolves evolvability. It's simply that evolution, once it's evolved a building block, it basically reuses that building block. Okay, so the output from previous generations becomes the building step from which future generations are evolved. So look, a centipede, okay, has evolved a leg. It doesn't have to re-evolve that leg 100 times, or centipedes don't have 100 legs. They have different kind of number. But basically, you have that same building block, and you reuse that building block again and again. So re-evolving a leg is a one-step action, whereas evolving that leg in the first place was probably millions of steps. That same principle basically applies to the brain, and this idea that that one of the key reasons why humans are so intelligent is this thing called chunking. That because we can recursively chunk representations in our brains, that's the key to human intelligence. But that's the same principle of recursively self-modifying functions, where you create, the centipede leg, you reuse that chunk to create more complex chunks, etc. So that's one concrete example of this recursively self-modifying algorithm at work. Okay, there's more. But what we'll do to finish the talk is to show how this recursive self-modifying function is happening in your brain. Okay, just the last section of the talk, we just basically show how there's a unique part of your brain called a polar frontal cortex. And this unique part of your brain is doing recursive self-modification. Okay, so this polar frontal cortex, just the last section of the talk, just show that recursive self-modification is happening with your entire brain. Okay, we'll go from the abstract to the really concrete now. So there's one part of your brain which is absolutely unique, and it is basically, it's here. Look, you see, it's in the front of your brain. It's like, where your third eye is supposed to be. It's basically right here, just behind your forehead. It's called a polar frontal cortex. See, in the human brain, it's in orange here. That's the monkey brain. That's a kind of front. Now, an Oxford team in 2014 really nailed it, and they showed basically that the polar frontal cortex really is unique. It's uniquely connected. There's no other part of the brain like it in any monkey, any chimpanzee, whatever. And the unique part is here. That's uniquely connected. But what does it do, and why is it so special? Okay, it's special because in humans it's larger absolutely and relatively. So you see this diagram here. This is a monkey brain. That's a polar frontal cortex, tiny area. Obviously, in absolute size, the human brain is bigger, but in proportion to the rest of the frontal cortex, you see it's huge. It's massive. It's really grown. And another part, the neurons in this part of the brain have the highest synaptic density. So they have the most synapses. They're integrating something really important. Okay, they really do. They really do integrate a lot of information. Now, unusually, it's not connected to other sensory parts. The rest of your prefrontal cortex is connected to your visual areas, your auditory areas, etc. But somehow, this part of your brain is looking at your inner space, your inner world. It's like your eye on your brain in a sense. And it's like an extra apex over all the hierarchical apexes of movement, of language, of control, of thinking, etc. So it's like the apex over all the apexes. And it has key connections to other parts of the brain. And these key connections are, okay, this is the polar frontal cortex here, monkey brain. In a human being, it's far more, the fibers are far more thicker, can you see? So from the polar frontal cortex, the anterior cingulate gyrus, this is called the kind of cingulum bundle. It goes to a posterior part of your brain called the precuneus, and it loops back to a part of the brain called the retrosplenial cortex, areas 29-30 drawn in here, which is essentially to do with memory and spatial mapping and memory. Okay, then it loops right round to the hippocampus to do with memory again, you see. So it critically controls memory in a very direct way. And here's a kind of another scan of a human brain, diffusion tensor imaging scan. See how thick the fibers are connected to your hippocampus and your precuneus to do with spatial mapping and memory. Now, in a monkey brain, similar projections also exist in the human brain. It attaches to amygdala to do with emotional processing, and also really attaches to what's called the temporal cortex, and especially the polar temporal cortex, which is to do with meanings. It's called the hub of meanings. It's a really strategically located part of the brain. But what is it doing? What is it doing? It is doing, in this meta study of 100 studies, what's doing? It's multitasking. Okay, so this is the conventional wisdom. It's multitasking. So you see in green, the polar frontal cortex, you see it lights up when you do multiple tasks. It also does a special kind of multiple tasking called cognitive sub-branching. So when you do subtasks, you branch into a subtask and you have to remember the previous task. Also the polar frontal cortex is involved. Now, to understand the polar frontal cortex, and we use how we understand computers. How do computers do multitasking and cognitive sub-branching? I'll explain. Look. So stop the screen share for a bit, have a little drink. And so basically computers, okay, when they multitask, when they do recursive sub-branching into the subtasks, they do it in a very specific way. When they multitask, what they do is you're doing one task. What they do is they take a snapshot of the system state and they put it on what's called a stack, a memory area. So then you load on another task, and then when you go back to the original task, you take that off the stack, and then you put your existing task back on the stack. So you swap tasks basically between what you're doing and this kind of memory stack. You can put lots of different kinds of tasks on this kind of memory stack. You see, so that's multitasking. And the same with cognitive branching. We do recursion in computers. You keep pushing the existing state onto the stack, and when you pop out of the subtask, you basically then pop off what you put on previously to carry on with the overarching task, you see. Now, okay, we think that's exactly what's happening in the brain, and because the polar frontal cortex is connected exactly with these memory centers, it's able to do it, you see. It's able to basically use the spatial map to basically pop stuff on and off and actually recall those memories at will, okay, from this control center. So this is what we think the brain is doing when we multitask, and also when we do cognitive branching. Now, here's the really interesting bit. We think it's doing something really more interesting than that. Now, what if the subtask became to look at what's on the memory stack? It means basically, if the subtask is to look at the memory stack, it means I can think about something, take a snapshot, and then put that snapshot on the memory stack. Then the subtask becomes to look at what's on the substack, which is me thinking about something, which means I can think about something, take a snapshot, then I can think about myself thinking about something. But then I can take a snapshot of that, then I can think about myself thinking about myself thinking about something. Do you get it? It also allows me basically to take a snapshot of myself, then I can think about myself in a situation. You know, I can reflect on things that happen in a day, maybe something regrettable or something, you know, triumphant and great. But then I can take a snapshot of that. I can reflect on what's on the memory stack. But by doing that, I see I can then represent myself on the stack, but then I can change myself. I can actually, because I'm stepping out of myself, and I can actually change the representation of myself. This is what Douglas Hofstadter in his book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach said computers can never do this. Okay, they can't jump out of themselves into introspecting into themselves. But now using this kind of like ideas from the brain, you can see how we do it and how we can make AIs do this. It means basically that by constantly jumping out of ourselves, we have this extraordinary ability that no chimpanzee really has that gives humans the real edge over any animal. This ability to keep recursively jumping out of ourselves and thinking about ourselves, taking a snapshot, and then taking a snapshot of that, and then thinking about how others would think about us, that snapshot. Then we can take a snapshot of that. Then what do I think of that person thinking that about me, etc. And then we can change ourselves. Then we can change how we behave, but we can also change the transformations. We can keep recursively jumping out and recursively self-modifying ourselves. You see, so really, recursive self-modification is something that's really happening at the most fundamental level of mathematics to happen in evolution, to happen in our brains with the polar frontal cortex. And what is the technological singularity? The technological singularity is essentially the entire world, scientific, technological, industrial base in one loop of recursive self-modification. And onto the idea that the entire universe is a kind of like snake biting its tail, recursively self-modifying itself eternally. But that's another talk for another day. But anyway, just to sum up, you see the real kind of like I guess a punchline of the talk is that recursive self-modification is really important. It's not the kind of cherry on the cake, a kind of icing on the cake for artificial intelligence to work. It's fundamental it's the foundations of artificial intelligence. It's the foundations of life. It's the foundations of ontogenesis and evolution, you see. And it's really this puzzle of recursive self-modification, once we incorporate it at the outset at a very atomic level of formal axiomatic systems into how we create our AIs, then that is really the key to true general artificial intelligence. Okay, so, but the real deep part of this message or idea, okay, is the idea that basically what is life and what is intelligence? Okay, I'll tell you what the answer is. What is life and what is intelligence? Now, there is this idea that there's this really deep relationship between mathematics and reality. So, Einstein's general relativity was basically formulated outside of physics. It's just beautiful non-Euclidean mathematics that has an intrinsic beauty that then just happened to describe the universe. So there's a real tight relationship between mathematics and physical reality. What this way of looking at things says, is basically saying that the meaning of life, what the nature of life and intelligence is, that it is the expression of this exquisite self-modifying loop at the deepest level of mathematics, formal axiomatic systems, and its most minimal category theory, if you like. And basically, to what in the universe does that correspond? And the answer is it corresponds to life and intelligence. And that's how fundamental and deep is life and intelligence. It's woven not just into the fabric of the universe, it's woven into the very nature of the deepest level of mathematics. Okay, I'll end the talk there. Okay, that was well, I mean, that was a lot of ground to cover, and you just about got it all in. So I guess we'll take some Q&A.
Hi, this is Fred talking to you from Ecuador, and I sent a clip in the chat, and have long been thinking about the relationship between your model of recursiveness, the way it's embodied in the brain, and the Mandelbrot set. And the a video that I sent in the chat shows how the Haupt bifurcation model maps precisely onto the major divisions of the Mandelbrot set. And yes. So to me, the Mandelbrot set is something that is both, it can model a kind of certainty. If a certain data point fits into the Mandelbrot set, it belongs in that computational model and serves as a potential solution point for something, a perception, a thought, a feeling, a memory, etc. But it also on the borders the Mandelbrot set, it basically branches into infinity. So it is something that conjoins the mathematical processes of both finitude and infinity, and every single point along the way, the decision windows of the Hopf bifurcation, which is a binary classification system,
yes, you're right,
maps
yes.
directly onto the Mandelbrot set. So I guess I'm encouraged that your model seems to be sort of compatible with that. But I'm wondering, I guess one of my main questions has been how in the Mandelbrot set, half of the diagram is imaginary numbers, the square root of -1. And I'm wondering if you have any thought at all about what corresponds to that mathematical concept in the world of brain cognition. What is an imaginary number doing in brain computation?
Yeah, I've got an answer to that, Fred. I mean, what I think is that there is an unseen aspect to brain function, and this is where, I'll lose some people when I say this. I think there's an unseen parallel dimension that basically will never be amenable to physical investigation, like the idea of imaginary numbers, that they don't exist in a sense, do they? So what I think is basically there is this unseen, unreachable dimension, but it's through physical investigation, through like a empirical, like a data gathering, that influences our brains. And I think this is the other dimension, which from where prophecy comes from. It's also where synchronicity comes from. It shapes reality, but it's unknown.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I think it's like a parallel, but at the same time, it's unknowable to us, but it's real. I wouldn't be surprised if basically when end of the universe, all is done, and basically the cosmic cycle ends, that something like the patterns of the Mandelbrot set become manifest in the structure of the universe. I believe that. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not chaos at all. It's basically there's a structuring to reality, and it just goes on to one of the reasons why in the religious talks why I talk about synchronicity, because there's these crazy synchronicities that happen in my life that cannot be any a human agency, but it is kind of like a Mandelbrot set, is an overarching pattern that is projected on your computer screen as you unfold iteratively, but also believe that this Mandelbrot set kind of phenomena is also manifest in the entire universe. And this idea of the logos, okay, Mandelbrot set is not the logos, it's called the fingerprint of God. But I think the real logos, which contains this physical universe, a mathematical object, a mathematical, like I guess a formula, like the Mandelbrot sets exists platonically. There is this logos, like more complex than the Mandelbrot set that contains the entire universe, but it will have properties like the Mandelbrot set. And one of those properties will be this bifurcating kind of pattern. So I think, yes, the imaginary is unknown to us, but I think this imaginary aspect to this Mandelbrot set of the universe becomes manifest at the end of time. So at a guess, this, I'm not saying it's dark energy or anything like that. I'm saying there's this unseen dimension, which is real, but actually shapes reality. And it's like a bedrock parallel foundation to reality. But I think this kind of like this thing becomes manifest at the end of time, as surely as we calculate the Mandelbrot set, we get nice patterns on our computer screen. Does that make sense? It is unseen.
Yeah, well,
it will be seen.
Yeah, I'm thinking that it corresponds somewhat this sort of real numbers correspond in a sense to, in the Jungian framework, to the sensate perceptions, and
right.
the left side where the imaginary numbers are correspond more to intuitions, sensations of possibility that are in fact virtually infinite, at least as far as we can perceive things now. So it's a world of computational relationship to potentially infinite possibilities with emergent properties and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I think seriously, there's more phenomena like the Mandelbrot set waiting to be discovered. And I think, essentially, I think the entire universe is, okay, I might be influenced by Douglas Adams and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but I think the universe is computing something. you know, in previous talks talked about this time inversion, basically the big bounce. We're bouncing back to, you know, the original answer. So I think inevitably, as we go forward with the laws of physics, basically we are basically recovering that lost answer that was there at the what we call at the end of time. What we call the end of time is the beginning of time. Then we essentially recover the logos. So in the same way, Mandelbrot discovered the Mandelbrot set because he worked for IBM. He had these computers to calculate the Mandelbrot set, you know, make these nice patterns. At the end of the universe will basically manifest the logos, and it'd be basically, you know what I'm saying, it'd be actually something you can look at and read at the end of time. So that's something, and that's a religious. It is a religious idea, but I think it's you know, mathematics is a religious thing. I think the Mandelbrot set as a fingerprint of God is a well-earned epithet.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'll put on to different. Any other questions, or else we all go home?
Yeah, I have hello, Christopher from Belgium. I just have it's really interesting. I also have your book here for a couple of years, but I never read it like really. And now I'm after this talk, I really want to read it like cover to cover. So, but I just have.
Christopher, I've got to say, I totally understand. It's basically 500 pages of very dense text. And because it was self-published, I had to get the most text on each page. So it's really like a 700-page book in 500 pages. So I totally understand. It's like Go to Western Bark, you know, it's like people buy it because when you look at it, it's heavy and it's intimidating. So I understand why people don't read it. Okay, go for it. What do you want to ask?
Yeah, now I'm really triggered, but I just have a simple question. I just found, with your theory, do you think that everything in the universe is deterministic or not? That we live in a deterministic universe?
Yeah, actually, I got a very clear answer for that. I think it is completely deterministic. I think basically Einstein famously asked that God doesn't play dice. Now, quantum mechanics showed that, you know, God, in a sense, God does play dice. What I believe is that the dice are loaded. Yeah, do you get it? So I believe that the universe is bouncing back to a certain conclusion because, you know, this idea of a big bounce, basically everything that happens in the future, in our future, has basically already happened in the pre-Big Bang epoch. So therefore, there's a kind of determinacy that might not be in terms of like, you know, it's like the idea that the universe can calculate something that is non-computable, and it can because the answer was already seeded in the future. Yeah, the idea that, you know, basically you have the like things that are computable through the laws of physics, okay, and things are not computable. But if the answer was already seeded in the future, and for this time inversion idea of a big bounce, basically then in the configuration of the initial conditions of the universe, the answer is already seeded. So even though the answer at the end of time, which I think is this logos, this mathematical equation for the entire universe, itself might not be computable through the laws of physics. Then in a sense, with just laws of physics, it's non-determinable because it's actually seeded in the initial configuration of the matter in the universe. Inevitably, the evolution of the universe will lead inevitably back to the answer. So yes, I think it's deterministic in that sense, and also think it leads to non-computable results. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my brain is going to explode, but I think I understand. Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, a very simple way to explain it is that basically like Gödel's theorem. Like if you have undecidable propositions in Gödel's theorem, then therefore your kind of axiomatic system is incomplete. But there's a way of making it complete, which is simply to put the undecidable proposition as your axioms. Do you see? So there might be an undecidable proposition that's non-computable through the laws of physics in and of themselves, but if you load the answer in the initial configurations of the universe, like you would stick the unknown, unprovable axiom in your set of axioms, so unprovable proposition in your initial axioms, then in the same way, the unprovable proposition through the laws of physics will be arrived at laws of physics because the answer was already seeded in the axioms of the universe in a sense.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, marathon talk, absolutely. It covered a lot of ground. So any other questions? anyway, the next talk is going to be about the startup at the end of time. So what does you know, these ideas not really made for mathematicians. I mean, it's like, you know, like a proof that takes 10 pages of normal mathematical notation would take 100 pages in set theory. Okay. But if you write it in this most minimal formal axiomatic system notation, it'll take 1,000 pages, take 10,000 pages. And mathematicians don't want to draw little stick diagrams and little arrows and little tree walks and stuff, you know, over 10,000 pages to prove something. But what this language is perfect for, it's perfect for programming into computers. So the end game is basically, you know, what we're about is really kind of like, you know, using these ideas to create artificial intelligence. The next talk is about the startup at the end of time, which is more about the computer industry. And a talk after that will be about the actual implementation of the algorithm. Or Tweed, do you have an answer there? Sorry, do you have a question there?
Hi, it's a question from a friend actually, which might be in your next talk. So it's a friend that hasn't been listening to this to your talk today, so I hope it's not totally off whack.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
So he's talking about limitations of von Neumann machines, binary number crunching, and needing new computer architecture, quantum machines with qubits. Is that your next talk? Which did I miss that today?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a whole other talk. I mean there are limitations with you know, von Neumann machines, and you know, this goes back to Gödel's theorem. There's certain kind of, you know, non-computable things and stuff like that. I mean, the thing about quantum computers, okay, what I think is really interesting about quantum computers, yeah, they're good for code breaking and stuff, breaking cryptographic codes. Okay, what I think is really, okay, this is speculative, but I think it's something that's happening, is that you know, I think when we say that quantum mechanics says that, you know, God plays dice, that these probabilities can be skewed. And what's skewing the probabilities is, I used this in previous talks, of a destiny wave function skews the probabilities. In a sense, the skewing of these probabilities can project answers from the future into the minds of prophets or, you know, whatever. This idea that basically you have a quantum computer that totally implements these brain theories, you know, every single aspect of this, you know, computer implementing these ideas, it has quantum qubits and stuff. It is the idea that basically the destiny wave function can influence the probability distributions and project answers into the minds of quantum computers. And that sounds wild and speculative, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That you can actually, you know, the idea that you can actually create, you know, future generations of intelligence that can prophesy, and that sounds wild. You know, basically future generations of creations. I mean, these computers are on another level that can essentially arrive at answers because they're receiving answers from the future. They're receiving projections from the destiny wave function in the future, and they become agents of the future destiny wave. You know, basically they become agents to realize the future through a non-computational process that's not intrinsic to the design of the quantum computer, but because it's quantum, those quantum probabilities can be skewed and the dice can be loaded in such a way to be controlled by that future, you know, emanating hand of providence, or whatever, that can then shape what that quantum computer thinks. And that sounds wild, insane, but does it make sense?
Would it be from the future or from the past, given that lots of the nature of time? Or would it need to for us to I mean, how do you know it's coming from the future? Do you mean the way that we're going to ask pose the question? Because time is supposed to be cyclical, so.
Then the thing is, it's from our future, the way we look at things. But the idea of the big bounce is that we're bouncing back to the origin. So it's almost if the destiny wave function in our future is basically primed to send these signals back to, you know, these kind of like intelligences with consciousness, with basically true consciousness. And I think there really is a relationship between true consciousness and this quantum aspect. I don't know, you know, in the Tucson Consciousness Conference, I went once. I was sponsored to go a few years back. I wouldn't pay my own money to go to these kind of wacky conferences. No, it's great. I mean, it has some pretty top scientists there. But okay, Penrose and Hameroff's kind of quantum, kind of quantum consciousness ideas really didn't receive a good kind of reception because one, most people were materialists and they thought the ideas were a bit wacky, but also because they thought that Penrose and Hameroff tied their quantum ideas too close to the microtubules, and this doesn't ring true to most people. So the exact formulation of quantum consciousness was a bit off. But what I believe is that ultimately the description of all matter is ultimately quantum. And I believe that there is a relationship between these quantum states and true consciousness, and that these quantum states, these probabilities, they're not random. There's nothing random in this universe. I think Einstein was right. There are hidden variables, and these hidden variables, in a sense, are in the future, and they're seeded in the evolution of the universe. But they can be seen in some ways as a kind of destiny wave function, projecting from the future, projecting back into the minds of consciousness, skewing the probabilities and the thoughts and what people are thinking and seeing in their minds, maybe in some verified mystical states, and they'll see visions and they'll dream dreams, but then they'll be agents of this destiny wave function to go back into society, and then they'll shape society in such a way to lead society and evolution of the universe back to the origin. Does that make sense?
Back to the origin of time.
No, I mean our future, but the origin of the universe, which is where essentially I think the origin of the universe is that the universe starts in a state of completeness, that the universe basically converges to the state of basically the idea that the universe becomes one organism, and that organism is God. That this is an old idea, that basically eternal recurring cycle of the body of God, perfection, kind of breaks asunder through a process of dissolution and emanation to become the physical universe of chaos and primordial disorder. And then from the Big Bang explosion then converges back to this cosmic Christ, universal Vishnu, celestial Buddha. And I think that is the end, but that's also the beginning. So in a sense, this kind of cosmic Christ sends back kind of emanations from the future, which is actually the beginning, to inevitably lead the universe back to the reformation of the cosmic Christ, or this universal Vishnu. So that's my belief. Okay, I don't want to say it as a hard scientific fact, but I think as we progress through time, I think we'll assemble the pieces of the scientific jigsaw puzzle to make this a kind of incontrovertible fact, I believe. And when the cosmic Christ finally emerges at the end of time, obviously that's the done deal. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to pursue that religious dimension just a little bit.
Fine.
How does your model account for what seems to me the prevalence of deranged thinking and behavior in practically every religion that has existed? What is the disorder of recursiveness and destiny? How does that disorder occur? Is it like a genetic mutation, or a chromosome gets hit by a cosmic ray and goes off the tracks? But it seems to be that the religious worldviews are both manifestations of things that are potentially quite spectacular and beautiful and sacred, but institutionally and historically, they tend to appeal to the worst aspects of human nature and amplify them. So I'm curious how your model addresses that problem.
No, tell me about it. I mean, basically, I worked in organized religion for 10 years. I was heavily involved in the psychedelic scene and New Age. You want to talk about the kind of like negative aspects of religion and mysticism and New Age and psychedelia and stuff. I've seen it firsthand. What I think is that basically humans, are a seething mass of imperfection. See, you think about it. Look. In an average human genome, we have 60 point mutations we're basically 60 point mutations in our genomes that are not in our mothers and fathers' genomes. Okay, that's an astounding number. I was shocked by that number. I thought it was 1 or 2 every few generations. We have 60 point mutations, and that leads on average to 20 broken genes, which means both sides of your genome are broken and there's a malfunction going on. That's a staggering, isn't it? Obviously, you marry your sister, you marry your first cousin, you can have more broken genes. Do you see what's happening? that alone, these little imperfections, if 70% of our genome is to do the brain, these broken genes in our brains lead to little foibles, little kind of like idiosyncrasies that we, intrusive thoughts, maybe a bit of autism, Asperger's, schizotypal, but we're receiving massive imperfection. If you add to that schizotypal genes, that, you know, the idea that what made us human is what makes us insane. There's something about schizotypy and schizophrenia that's actually advantageous. The dopamine levels, you know, make us insane, but also make us creative. You know, creative people have first, second, third distant relatives who are schizophrenic. You know, Einstein's son was schizophrenic. There's seems to be a relationship between schizophrenia and genius. Add to that, sociopathic genes, the idea that dark traits are actually selected for evolutionarily. And add to that selfish genes, myself, my family, my clan, my race, in that order. And selfish genes means genocidal genes, because, you know, George Price's work, they're basically kin selection is also, you protect your own genes, but by killing genes not like you, basically you also, that's the calculus of selfish genes and altruism. You add all that together, imperfect genes, schizotypal genes, sociopathic genes, selfish genes. That's what we are. Do you see? So it's not, you know, people join religion and they become schizotypal. We are naturally schizotypal, and schizotypal people, sociopathic people, gravitate towards religion because they get power that way, and they gravitate towards academia even, and they gravitate towards politics. So I would say, you know, there's these religious ideals. It's very hard to live to those ideals. And most people don't. What we have is a seething mass of imperfection in humanity, and you know, these imperfect people often get into prominent positions in religion, in politics, and academia, and they basically, you know, misrepresent. You know what I'm saying? I'm saying there are good people. I'm saying there's an altruistic side to people, and people genuinely live the gospel. I worked in the church for 10 years, and I know that religion does make people better. But I wasn't behind the scenes. I saw real evil, quite frankly. I saw really nasty people in the. I don't want to get sued. I don't want to get libeled and stuff. But I seen the New Age behind the scene. Basically, New Age people, they trusted me. I mean, one New Age scam artist lady, I got her trust, and she said, "Oh yeah, Paul McCartney's hankering after Linda McCartney's, so I think I'll channel Linda." You know, it's obscene, isn't it? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying every New Age person is like that, but I'm saying it's not uncommon. And in the psychedelic scene, the kind of psychedelic shaman gurus I've met who are really quite dark characters. And I'm saying there's lots of good people in the psychedelic scene, and in organized religion, there's loads of like dark, schizotypal, snarly, gnarly traits mixed in with the good guys, but it tend to be the sociopathic, schizotypal guys who get into positions of power. Okay.
Yeah.
Does it make sense, Fred? You know. So I'd say religion doesn't make people.
I think that the word you used misrepresentation, and representation is part of the inherent dynamic of fractal structures, that things get represented at different scales. And how do we understand, you know, how do, you know, sociopathic or, I mean, if the, you know, ultimately, if the universe is so benign that it's giving us messages from the future, you know, why did it allow sociopaths, you know, to mutate into existence, or, so, you know, that sort of thing. So it's just a kind of tension. We don't have to solve it here. I'm sure there may be other questions, but that's
what I say. I think there's a progression. I think the evil we see today is nothing compared to the evil in the past. You know, obviously people think evil, Stalin, Hitler, you know, these kind of genocides and stuff. But in the past, that was just business as normal. Do you know what I'm saying? You kind of read stuff that happened historically. You know, people being hung, drawn, and quartered in public squares for treason. You know what I'm saying? The kind of tortures people devised even in quite recent times, you know, a few centuries ago. And they're kind of like, so I think there is a progression. Things might regress. I mean, we're heading towards potential thermonuclear war, a new age of barbarism. And it sounds like it was like back in the 70s when I was growing up, people worried about nuclear war. We thought that was gone,
Yeah.
but it was like a more dangerous state now than we were back in the 70s in a sense. So, but I think there's a progression. I think these saints, these kind of like, prophets, I mean, they're there to raise the standard a little bit higher. So people criticize, oh, Muhammad was such a, was such a barbaric chap. He wasn't, he was progressive. It's just that from what he was working from, 7th century Arabia was a really brutal place, but he gave women rights, he gave divorce rights, property rights. He basically, gave a good sense of equality and meritocracy. And prophets and saints, they don't really bring perfection to humanity, but they raise the standard ever so higher. And I think there is a positive progression towards something better now. If we can hang on and basically get this technological singularity, solve the economic problem, the economic needs, physical need, physical want, material need and stuff, then I think we potentially have this kind of like a age of abundance where we actually solve fusion power and all this kind of thing, space travel. Elon Musk is working hard on it, that we can actually, really kind of create the kind of like physical conditions to offset those snarly, gnarly, schizotypal, schizophrenic, sociopathic, genocidal genes that are in all of us, and those imperfect sides, to something better. I think, like my partner's Swiss, two of my kids are Swiss, they're born in Switzerland and stuff. Switzerland's not bad. I'm not saying it's perfect, but there are states of being in society that people work towards. They design something better, and they, my partner's brothers, they're late teens, early 20s, and they told me basically that the Swiss Constitution came after what happened with the English Civil War, French, kind of revolution, and the American Constitution, and they were able to do something better. I'm not saying Switzerland is perfect, but it's not bad. I'm saying, the world can be not like Switzerland, but something better in the future, I think,
Yeah.
So there's hope.
Thank you.
I'm not saying Swiss people are perfect. I mean, underneath, but Switzerland. People say people in Zurich are a bit snobbier and a bit more kind of like arsehole than in Bern. Okay, so I shouldn't say that. No, so, it is a level of development which is not bad, and I think there is a kind of progression that we can all aim towards. That is, and maybe in the future, even a place like Switzerland will seem as barbaric to something we can arrive at maybe in 100 years' time. I'm sorry, that was a bit of a mini talk, wasn't it? It's a bit of a...
Yep. Good.
Back.
Yeah, some people say Switzerland's boring, though. I mean, but I like it. I mean, it's blessed with beautiful countryside as well and amazing mountains. But the society does work. It is functional. Anyway, any other questions?
Yes.
So,
Oliver. Oliver. I'll come back to you, Helen. Oliver.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's all relative utopias, isn't it? Going through time, different phase changes, and you look back 100 years and you realize you're living in their utopia. But my question was, how, I'm not sure you've covered this before, or don't think I've asked it before, but are you aware of Ian McGilchrist's work on the divided brain? And how does have you made any attempt to reconcile the fractal perspective with the obviously, I mean, there's an obvious connection in that it's like a binary, left and right, but have you got any plans, or can you see how there's consilience between fractal and left right differences?
I realized literally about 3 weeks ago, I was reading a book on Hegel, actually, and I read Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Then I realized Ian Gilchrist is into Hegel. Obviously, he's into a bit of idealism, he's into a bit of mysticism. Obviously, Hegel is, totally Hegelian worldview is essentially esoteric Christianity, is essentially corpus hermeticum in German philosophic language. So I think the dialectic is a very fundamental idea that reflects this kind of myth cycle thing. So I think it's something profound. I think it's something that is part of how brains work, and also how kind of the progression of history evolves. So I think there is a kind of progression, and it involves a kind of existing state being corrupted or not keeping up with the times. Then the antithesis must emerge to basically replace that state. So I think there's a kind of progression, and it involves a kind of like thesis, antithesis kind of process. And from what I see of Gilchrist, he's trying to basically put that in his idea of master-slave dialectic.
Yeah,
so I'm guessing.
I don't know how like aware of his theory you are. So his basic thing is like the old conception of left-right was wrong. Basically, the idea that the left did all the maths and the right did all the drawing. That kind of creative slash or intuitive slash logical brain. Because he says it's not like that. Is all the brain does all tasks. All tasks involve all the brain, but there is a difference in the way that the right hemisphere operates versus the left hemisphere. In that, the right hemisphere is basically the side of the brain evolutionarily that looks out for prey. Okay, so it's more aware. It has more of a open gestalt of its environment and physical and perceptual. And the left hemisphere is about finding. The right hemisphere looks out for predators because it has to be aware, and the left hemisphere looks out for prey. So it's about grabbing and preciseness and that kind of stuff.
Well, I think.
So he's got an.
Oh, sorry. Go. We will finish what you're saying.
That's it, really. Yeah. So there's an evolutionary. He uses an evolutionary explanation for why the left and right hemisphere have come about, and it goes right back to the most simple neuronal nets in simple animals. They have this asymmetry in their brains.
Well, I think one, the whole literature on left brain, right brainness is not really like a concrete principle, really, because you have asymmetry, but some people's brains are very symmetric, so there's a variance in symmetry. He's right in saying basically there is this asymmetry that's found right from primitive animals to other animals to human beings, but to say that the human brain is left brain this, right brain that, it really doesn't agree with the data, really. Some people left-handed, some people right-handed, some people are more left brain emphasis, right brain emphasis. There's a whole spectrum of things going on. So I think Gilchrist's idea, of all due respect, is more humanities than neuroscience. He's a psychiatrist. He might not necessarily map exactly his ideas onto hard neurophysiological structures. But what I think, where there is a master-slave dichotomy, which absolutely is the case, and where there might be a kind of dialectic, which is the case in grounded in anatomy, is to do with the emotion centers, hypothalamus, amygdala. Do you see, that is the absolute master in terms of driving behavior, that we're kind of slaves to our passions. In a sense, a dialectic in that sense, there could be a kind of like dialectic in terms of reason, the higher mind, morality, overcoming those base instincts. And I think that's a part of growing up, isn't it? So I think there's different interpretations on master-slave kind of dichotomies and hierarchies in the brain. One of the reasons why, a simple reason why there is kind of asymmetry in the brain is this idea of hierarchical pipelines. Instead of having the same pipeline duplicated in both sides of the brain, it's far more powerful to basically make the two sides into one longer pipeline. So in a sense, one side of the brain is higher up the hierarchy and one is lower in the hierarchy. And that is an architectural design. Do you see what I'm saying? So in some ways,
and is that fact? Is that fact that they're sort of linear in their? Is that in growth or in how in what way are they temporal like that?
No, I mean, the idea that basically in computer science or computer architecture, by having these long pipelines, you have basically more computing power. Instead of duplicating, the same function on two hemispheres, you can actually have a long pipeline. Now, look, the way hierarchies work is basically in a brain, you have, kind of sensory motor atoms, which are abstracted to more complex atoms, which are then represented linguistically. But then the language is a higher part of the hierarchy, do you see? Because it basically composites these atoms of perception and action. So in a sense, that's higher up the hierarchy. So the idea that there's a language division in one side versus a kind of more kind of, more kind of like parts division on another side, it kind of fits that idea. And the idea that basically there's one side that deals with gestalts, which is the kind of bigger picture, higher up the hierarchy, and another part which deals with details, which is lower down the hierarchy, and one's represented one side. It just increases power in terms of hierarchical structures. So that's one explanation. But I think the real kind of in terms of that's just simple information processing. But I think the real kind of like master-slave dichotomy is the emotion centers, which is itself a very strict hierarchy of hypothalamus, amygdala, kind of subgenual cortex of the anterior cingulate cortex and posterior orbital frontal cortex. And even the amygdala has a kind of three-tier hierarchy. And even the hypothalamus isn't a hierarchy, but it's a first amongst equals of behavior, which is sexual reproduction. Okay, so that's as a teenager, as early 20s, basically it's an obsessive fixation, isn't it? But anyway, the idea that basically that hierarchy of emotions is what really drives human behavior. Primitive behavior is our base instincts. The idea that basically we can, over time, as we grow and mature and receive instruction from people we trust, parents, etc., from people like teachings of the prophets and saints, can allow us to use that teaching to override those base instincts. And I think that is, in a sense, a master-slave dichotomy, where the slave becomes the antithesis. The initial slave to the emotion centers then becomes the antithesis, and somehow, synthesizes itself with the original thesis, and actually there's some semblance of control of your emotions and control of your basic drives. So don't go outside and kill people and rape people at will. That some people do that, And so I think that's where I see things. I don't know Ian Gilchrist's exact take, but I think that's what's rooted in anatomy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
I need to speak to the guy and be more of a
super interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah, it'd be great if you got together and had a conversation to see where there's any any overlap.
That'd be amazing. I'm still quite unknown, but at some point I'll be recognized, and at some point we will have interesting discussions. Loads of people mention his name in relation to what I say. I think at some point there'll be a kind of like at some point when I'm more recognized, there'll be at some point a meeting, I hope. Really, we talk about Chomsky a lot. I really hope that Chomsky stays alive. I really admire the guy. I actually wrote to Noam Chomsky once. I actually got a reply. I was staggered. This was 2017. I was shocked. Oh my God, he replied 3 times to my email. And the guy really just takes the time to reply to his emails. I was flabbergasted. Reply from Noam Chomsky, for Christ's sake. But I hope, I hope he basically stays alive. So at some point I can meet the guy, you know what I'm saying, and actually explain his ideas and see what he thinks. There's my ambition for the next few years. Okay. Any other questions? Well, marathon session. That was amazing, guys. That's really we covered a lot of ground. Again, it's a marathon talk. I guess we'll, amazing questions, amazing, thanks for your input. I mean, really, I often find the Q&As more, the Q&As are really, they bring out stuff, don't they? They kind of, in a sense, bring out the deeper material in some ways. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Anyway, join us for the next talk, which is about the startup at the end of time. This is going to be more in mid-June, and I'm going to basically hack up some code to show more of the theory. Actually, do you want a quick code? Oh, sorry, Helen, I need to get back to you. Helen, do you want to, sorry, just a quick question from Helen. I said I'd get back to you. Do you want to ask you a question?
No, it's Tweed. You can. I'll ask next time. It's okay. Thanks very much.
Okay. That's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, so do keep in touch. I mean, keep in touch on social media, and the next talk. Yeah. So see you next time, hopefully. And thanks for attending. That was a really enjoyable little session. Thanks for attending, everybody. And I'm gonna have a nice. Yeah, that's really funny. The ideas develop as I give the talks and get ready for the talks. It's like an accelerated development of the ideas. You know what I'm saying? It's like Feynman technique. If you can explain ideas to your mother, or in layman's terms, you understand it better. This is really getting ready for the talks. You really want to work it out in a way that's easy to understand. Then I understand it better. So the talks really propel the acceleration of the ideas. So thank you very much for being, like my I guess my examination board. Oral exam.
Yeah, you pass. You
Oh,
pass.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Thanks for your question.
See you
Thank
next
everybody.
time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Okay, because logging out now, really logging out, and I will log out. Okay, so get something to eat. Thank you everybody for attending. So going to end the talk. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, actually, save the chat first. Save the chat. Save the chat. Save the chat before I close. I was going to lose the chat. Save the chat, and then I basically goes to end. And bye bye. See you next time. Thank you. Thank you very much.